Hello everyone, and welcome back to Conspiracy Seed. So today, we're going to be doing the whole Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg. Thank you so much for choosing to spend some time with me today, and let's just get into it.
Nothing like being subscribed to Conspiracy Seed on YouTube. Nothing like it.
So I actually made a whole video just on this, so we're going to start with this one. If you want to learn more about it in depth, you can go ahead and click here, and this will take you to my video. But I will sum it up, just in case you don't have time to watch it, or you just don't want to watch it. Speaking of, if you actually want me to do like a deeper dive onto any of these subjects, let me know, and I'll go ahead and I'll add it to my list. The Zodiac Family murders actually happened to the Miyawaza family who lived in the Zodiac district of Tokyo, Japan. The killer likely entered through the second-story bathroom window, murdered the family, then spent time in the family's house, using their computer as it was logged on at 1 in the morning. Despite the killer leaving behind thousands of pieces of evidence, I think it's like 27,000 pieces of evidence, including fingerprints, hair strands, his scarf, the suspect has never been found, a suspect has never been named, and no one's ever been arrested. The Zodiac Killer, famously known as Senator Ted Cruz from Texas, is actually the pseudonym of an unidentified serial killer. The Zodiac Killer operated in Northern California in the late 1960s. The killer has been described as the most famous unsolved murder case in American history. Multiple amateur detectives attempted to solve it, and it became a fixture in pop culture. He killed 5 known victims in the San Francisco Bay Area between December of 1968 and October of 1969, and mostly killed in rural or urban or suburban areas, which is pretty much all the areas in the San Francisco Bay Area. So he actually targeted 3 young couples and then 1 lone male cab driver. And if you're doing the math, that's 7 people, not 5. But 2 of his victims actually survived, and they were the ones that gave their accounts that made this composite sketch. The Zodiac Killer claims to have murdered 37 victims and has been linked to several other cold cases, but only the 5 dead and 2 injured are the only ones to be confirmed. He coined his name in a series of letters and cards that he sent to regional newspapers in which he threatened killing sprees and bombings if they weren't printed. The letters included ciphers in which the killer claimed that he was collecting his victims as slaves for the afterlife. Of the 4 ciphers that he mailed in, only 2 have been solved, and until 2020, only 1 of them had been solved. While many theories in regards to the identity of the killer have been suggested, the only suspect authorities have ever publicly named was Arthur Leigh Allen, a former elementary school teacher and convicted sex offender who died in 1992. The Zodiac Killer ceased communications around 1974, but the case is still open and active to this day. The Axeman of New Orleans is an unidentified serial killer who was active in New Orleans and surrounding communities in May 1918 to October of 1919. As the name suggests, his victims were usually attacked with an axe, which often belonged to the victims themselves. He mostly targeted Italian immigrants or Italian Americans, leaving the possibility that the killings were racially motivated. However, since he was never caught, this can't exactly be proven, and as an Italian myself, I just gotta say, what the heck, man? You don't like it when I cook it a pizza? In most cases, the intruder would break into the house, then attack 1 or more of the residents with either an axe or a straight razor. The straight razor man of New Orleans. The crimes weren't robberies gone wrong, as nothing was ever removed from the victim's house. Many media outlets sensationalized the racial aspects of the crimes, even suggesting that the mafia was involved, despite a lack of evidence. The Axeman was never caught or identified, and his crime spree stopped just as quickly and mysteriously as it had started. On March 13th, 1919, a letter purporting to be from the Axeman was published in the newspapers, saying that he would kill again at 15 minutes past midnight on the night of March 19th, but would spare the occupants of any place where a jazz band was playing. That night, all of New Orleans dance halls were filled to capacity while jazz played, and bands played jazz at parties at hundreds of houses around the town, and there were no murders that night. Do you want to hear a real conspiracy? Roughly 50% of all my viewers are not subscribed. That's 50% of people, that's half of the people that watch my videos are not subscribed. Go ahead, hit that subscribe button. Today. The Arcana Moonlight Murders was a series of 4 unsolved murders and related violent crimes committed around the Arcana region of Arkansas and Texas in the late winter and spring of 1946. They were attributed to an alleged unidentified serial killer known as the Phantom of Arcana, or alternatively the Phantom Killer, or even Phantom Slayer. See, we need to stop giving serial killers such cool names. The Phantom Slayer? That sounds cool as heck. Like, we'd probably have less killers if we stopped giving them cool names. The Night Stalker, the Phantom Slayer, Ted Bundy. Name him small-brained doo-doo head killer. That'll stop future killers. The attacks occurred between February 22nd and May 3rd, targeting couples or males and female pairs. The first 3 attacks were at Lover's Lane or on quiet stretches of road on the Texas side, and the 4th attack occurred at an isolated farmhouse in Arkansas. The news reports caused a state of panic in Arcana. Residents armed themselves and at dusk locked themselves indoors while police patrolled the streets and neighborhoods. Stores sold out of guns, ammo, locks, and other protective equipment. Some vigilantes actually attempted to bait and ambush the killer. Investigations were conducted at the city, county, state, and federal levels, and in the course of the investigation, there have been shifting opinions by officials over whether the 1st and 4th attacks were even committed by the same person. The prime suspect of this case was Ul Swinney, a career petty criminal who was linked to the murders primarily by statements from his wife and additional circumstantial evidence. However, after his wife refused to testify against him, prosecutors decided against pursuing murder charges. He was convicted on other charges and sentenced to jail as a forger and car thief. Jack the Ripper is an unidentified serial killer who was active around the Whitechapel district of London in autumn of 1888. Attacks attributed to the Ripper typically involved women working as prostitutes who lived and worked in the slums of the East End of London. Their throats were cut prior to mutilations of their stomach and abdomen area. The removal of internal organs from at least 3 of the victims led to speculation that their killer had some sort of surgical or human anatomical knowledge. Rumors that the murders were connected intensified and basically started in September and October of 1888, and numerous letters were received by media outlets and Scotland Yard from individuals purporting to be the murderer. The name originated from the Dear Boss letter written by an individual claiming to be the murderer, which was published in the press. The letter is widely believed to have been a hoax and may have been written by journalists, in fact, to heighten interest in the story and increase their newspaper circulation. Whoa, journalists making up stuff? Unheard of. There's another letter called the From Hell letter, which was received by George Lusk of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee and came with half of a preserved human kidney purportedly taken from one of the victims. The public started to believe in the existence of a single serial killer known as Jack the Ripper, mainly because of both the extraordinarily brutal nature of the murders and the media coverage of the crimes. Extensive newspaper coverage bestowed widespread and enduring notoriety internationally about the Ripper worldwide. A police investigation into the series of murders committed was unable to connect all of the killings. 5 victims, however, known as the Canonical 5, are often considered the most likely to be linked together. The murders were never solved, and the legends surrounding the crimes became a combination of historical research, folklore, and conspiracy pseudo-history. The St. Valentines Day Massacre was a murder of 7 members and associates of Chicago's North Side gang that occurred on St. Valentine's Day in 1929. At first, my understanding of this was that it was done by Al Capone and his gang, so I kind of wondered why it was on here, but doing further research, that's not true. The men were gathered at a Lincoln Park, Chicago garage on the morning of February 14, 1929. They were lined up against a wall and shot by 4 unknown assailants, 2 of which were dressed as police officers. The murders were a result from the competition of control of organized crime in the city during Prohibition between the largely Irish Northsiders and the largely Italian Chicago outfit rivals led by Al Capone. The perpetrators have never been identified. However, former gang members of the Egan's Rats gang worked for Capone and are suspected to be involved. Others have said that members of the Chicago Police Department themselves, who allegedly wanted revenge for the killing of one of the police officers' sons, were the ones who did it. The Valis Axe Murders occurred on the night of June 9th, 1912, in the small town of Valiska, Iowa. In the darkness, an unknown person infiltrated the home of the Moore family, where Josiah and Sarah Moore, along with their 4 children and 2 of their children's friends, slept. The killer then took an axe to each of the residents of the house. The aftermath of the tragedy left the community in shock and in disbelief, forever scarred by the senseless brutality that had unfolded. To this day, the Valis Axe Murders remain an unsolved mystery. The investigation that followed the gruesome crime revealed a series of perplexing clues and inconsistencies, further deepening the questions. Authorities found the murder weapon, the bloody axe, at the scene along with the victims' bodies. Despite extensive efforts, the identity of the murderer has remained shrouded in mystery, frustrating investigators and perpetuating a sense of unease within the town. Over the years, numerous theories and suspects have emerged, ranging from local residents to transient drifters passing through the area. Some believe that the crime was actually a result of personal grudges, while others speculate it was just a random act of pure violence. The Morse family home, where this actually happened, it still stands today, and visitors go there on ghost hunts. Now, the smiley face murder theory is actually kind of a highly debated hypothesis that suggests a connection between a series of drowning deaths of young men across several states in the United States. The theory is that these deaths, often ruled as accidental, may actually be the work of a group of serial killers. The name of this theory is derived from the alleged discovery of smiley face graffiti near some of the crime scenes. Advocates of the theory argue that there are striking similarities in the circumstances surrounding these cases, such as the victims being college-aged males, the presence of smiley face graffiti, and the bodies being found in bodies of water. They believe that these shared elements indicate a sinister pattern and deliberate effort to stage the scenes as accidental drownings. However, critics of the smiley face murder theory, including myself, say that there's a lack of concrete evidence linking these deaths and that the similarities are purely coincidental. These all take place in college towns near bodies of water. So lots of bars, nightlife in college towns, drunk, walking home, falls into the water. There also just happens to be graffiti because it's a college town, and it's one of the easiest things to graffiti, a little smiley face. I don't think they're connected at all, but that's what the theory states. Now, despite the ongoing debate and extensive media coverage, including me right now, law enforcement agencies have dismissed the theory almost completely, saying that there is insufficient evidence to support its claims, which I 100% agree with. So I actually made a whole video on this already, so we're going to start with this one, even though it's like at the end of tier 2. If you want to learn more about it, click here to see the whole video. I will sum it up, however, in case you don't have the time, or you just don't want to spend time watching my videos, that's fine. The HinterKY Effect murders occurred in 1922 in Germany. There were a number of suspects and a number of people who claimed to be the murderers, but no one was ever arrested or named as a person or people who could have committed the murders. The murderer killed the Gruber family, which consisted of Andrea, his wife Kazilia, their daughter Victoria, her son Josef, Victoria's daughter Kazilia Jr., and their maid Maria. The maid and the 2-year-old Josef were found in the house days later, and the rest were found piled up in the barn on top of each other. HinterKY Effect is actually one of my favorite topics that I've made a video on, so I do highly recommend watching the whole thing. There were even a number of people who visited the farm after they had been murdered, but none of them found the bodies. They would just show up and do their jobs, either fixing farm equipment or trying to sell something like door-to-door salesmen, and then they would leave. But just imagine being one of those people, like looking back to the time that you were on the farm and just knowing that there were 6 bodies within a few yards of you even, and you didn't know. I personally think that would like mess me up a lot, but I have extreme anxiety, so I guess it's really not that surprising. I still think about an earthquake that we had in Utah in 2020. It's been over 3 years since that happened. I still think about that every day. The Chicago Tylenol murders, which occurred in 1982, were a series of poisoning deaths resulting from cyanide-laced Tylenol capsules. The incident shook the nation and led to widespread panic and fear. 7 people died after consuming the laced product, prompting a nationwide recall on Tylenol products and the introduction of the tamper-proof packaging on the pharmaceutical industry. So like today, if you were to go get Tylenol, right, it has like a little thing at the top that you take off, and it just kind of shows that it hasn't been tampered with. The Chicago Tylenol murders served as kind of a catalyst for significant changes in product packaging and safety regulations, leaving a lasting impact on public health and consumer protection. The incident just kind of is like a stark reminder, I guess, of the potential dangers associated with product tampering and the need for safety measures to safeguard public well-being. Like, if we can get this kind of protection for food as well. Have you guys seen those videos where someone like goes to the store and like they open up the ice cream and then they lick it and they're like, yeah, and they close the ice cream and put it back? Sickos. Throw them in prison.
Right to jail.
Throw away the key. I don't ever want to see him again. The Ketty murders, also known as the Ketty cabin murders, refer to a brutal and unsolved homicide case that occurred in Ketty, California in 1981. The victims were a family of 4. Sue Sharp, who is recently divorced, her 2 children, Dana and John, and Dana's friend, also named Dana. The crime took place inside a cabin where the family resided, and the victims were found tied up and beat to death. This is just a small community in California, and the case shocked it and drew significant media attention. Despite extensive investigations, multiple suspects, and various theories, no one has ever been convicted for the Ketty murders, leaving the case shrouded in mystery and causing never-ending fear and pain for the victims' surviving family members. Since the Ketty murders have been unsolved, it is still an open cold case. However, it does leave us the unanswered question about the motive of the killer or killers, as well as their identity, of course. I will say I've always wanted to live in a cabin in the woods and like just grow a garden and kind of like live off the land and stuff, but stories like this always make me think twice, you know? Like, I'm far enough away from people that they can't hear me scream, you know? I don't know, man. I mean, yeah, I have weapons, but like if I'm asleep, what good are they? The Las Cruces bowling alley massacre refers to an incident that occurred on February 10th, 1990 in Las Cruces, New Mexico. 2 armed individuals entered the Las Cruces bowl and carried out the brutal attack, resulting in the deaths of 4 people and the severe injury of several others. The victims included the bowling alley's employees and customers who were shot during the robbery, even after complying with the robbers' demands. The case garnered significant attention and became one of the most notorious crimes in New Mexico's history. Despite initial arrests and trials, the true perpetrators remained at large for several years. First this, and now Walter White's out there slinging blue on the streets. New Mexico will never recover. The upstairs lounge arson attack, also known as the New Orleans Gay Bar Massacre, took place on June 24, 1973 in New Orleans, Louisiana. The upstairs lounge was a popular gathering place for the local LGBT community. That evening, an arsonist set fire to the stairwell leading to the lounge. The fire claimed the lives of 32 people, making it one of the deadliest attacks against the LGBT community in U.S. history at the time. The incident left the community devastated and traumatized, exacerbating the existing discrimination that they had already faced. Despite investigations, no one was ever charged or convicted for the arson attack. Not only did this happen during what is now Pride Month, But this video will be released just 5 days before the 50th anniversary of this event. So I mean, in my mind, it's just kind of crazy how the dates lined up. It happened in June, which is now Pride Month for, LGBT, and then the 50th anniversary of this will be 5 days after this video releases. This is kind of crazy. The I70 Killer, also known as the Midwest Serial Killer, was an unidentified serial killer who operated along the Interstate 70 corridor in the United States during the early 1990s. The killer targeted individuals at rest areas, gas stations, and other locations near the interstate. The victims were predominantly women who were sexually assaulted, robbed, and then brutally murdered. The I70 Killer's crime spree created a sense of fear and panic among communities along the highway, and law enforcement agencies worked diligently to apprehend whoever was doing this. Despite investigations and public appeals for information, the killer was never identified or captured. I know this is kind of something off topic, but hearing the name Midwest made me think about it. Why is Wisconsin a Midwest state? Call that Mideast. Utah is in the middle of the West, not Wisconsin. The West Mesa murders, also known as the Albuquerque serial killings, are a haunting and tragic chapter in the history of New Mexico. Lots happening in New Mexico, I guess. First the Las Cruces bowling, then Breaking Bad, and now this. Cannot catch a break. In 2009, the remains of 11 women were discovered buried in shallow graves on the West Mesa of Albuquerque. The victims were primarily young women involved in high-risk lifestyles such as prostitution or wrapped up in drug usage. The investigation into the West Mesa murders has been ongoing, with law enforcement tirelessly working to identify the perpetrator or perpetrators responsible for these heinous crimes. It really is sad though. A lot of unsolved murders are either people with high-risk lifestyles such as gang involvement or prostitution, or homeless people, and I think it's because they have the least amount of people looking out for them. It just makes me sad. Like there's got to be something that we as individuals can do to communicate to these people that, like, it's okay to try to break out of your bad situation, because I'll have your back. Or I don't know, man, but it's just, I want to do something to help these people. I'm unsure how. The Colonial Parkway murders refer to a series of unsolved homicides that occurred between 1986 and 1989 in the area surrounding the Colonial Parkway in Virginia. The victims, who were all young couples, were found dead under mysterious circumstances. The cases involved brutal killings, including shootings, stabbings, and strangulations. The exact number of victims is disputed, but it's believed that at least 8 people were killed. Of course, it remains an unsolved mystery despite extensive investigations by both local and federal law enforcement agencies. The lack of leads and the apparent lack of a clear motive have made it even more difficult to bring the perpetrators to justice. It seems like someone was just doing this for fun and not necessarily because they had any vendetta against any of these people. Hopefully one day these killers will be brought to justice and we can provide some sort of closure to the victims' families. The Doodler, also known as the Black Doodler, see, this is what I'm talking about. That is a bad serial killer name. They didn't call him like the Black Phantom Killer or nothing. They called him the Black Doodler. If I was a serial killer and they named me the Black Doodler, I would turn myself in. I'd be like, no, give me a cooler name. Anyway, the Black Doodler was a serial killer who operated in San Francisco, California during the mid-1970s. The killer targeted primarily young gay men and is believed to have murdered at least 5 victims. The nickname Doodler stemmed from the killer's habit of sketching caricatures of his intended victims before engaging in sexual acts with them. The Doodler's victims were usually found stabbed to death, often with the bodies left in secluded areas. Despite the severity of the crimes and initial attention from law enforcement, the case remains, of course, unsolved. The fear and stigma surrounding homosexuality at the time may have hindered the investigations and led to reluctance among potential witnesses to come forward. I can't believe that I'm doing 2 tiers from this iceberg in the month of June, and one of them has not 1 but 2 killings of gay people during Pride Month. It seems disrespectful. Also, the Doodler, it reminds me of like a Batman villain, like the Riddler almost, except he's like, hey Batman, check this out. And he like whips out a pencil and like a notepad and he's like, find this person, this is who I'm gonna kill. I don't know. That could be like a cool concept for a comic book. Like he like draws the person he's gonna kill and he's like, good luck, Batman. DC, you can have that one for free, but for more ideas I'm gonna need a commission of some sort. The Frog Boys, also known as the Worry family case, refers to a tragic and unresolved disappearance that occurred in South Korea in 1991. 5 boys between the ages of 9 and 13 went out to catch frogs near their hometown of Daegu, but never returned. A massive search operation was launched involving thousands of volunteers, police, and military personnel even, but no trace of the boys was found for more than a decade. In 2002, a man discovered skeletal remains in the nearby Mount Warryong, which were later identified as the missing boys. The cause of their death remains unknown, as their remains provided very limited information. The Frog Boys case has left unanswered questions, fueling speculation and conspiracy theories, of course. Now, this sad story is just one of the examples of why parents are giving their kids less and less freedoms to just go out and about with their friends, especially at a young age. I know this happened decades ago, but those changes don't just happen overnight. It's a gradual change, and this is just one of the cogs in the machine of change. As a society, it feels like we're going backwards. We need to be able to give children, I think, more freedom to run around outside and play and have a good time. And there's like a pond like 2 miles from my house and like a mile from my parents' house where I used to live, and just walk down there all the time, look for snakes, catch frogs, go fishing. And it's just like, it just seems like that doesn't happen as much anymore. And maybe I'm, old or senile or jaded or whatever, but it seems like parents have a pretty good case for not letting their kids go out anymore. And this kind of thing just kind of perpetuates that, unfortunately. The Lane Bryant shooting is a suspected robbery gone wrong, happening on February 2nd, 2008 at a Lane Bryant clothing store in a suburb of Chicago, Illinois called Tinley Park. The shooting killed 5 people and injured 1 other. The shooter took 4 customers, a part-time employee, and the store manager to the back of the store and shot them. Now, if you're doing the math, that's 6 people. The part-time employee lived, but was seriously injured. Police found the victims after they received a 911 call that morning. The gunman was described as a black man with thick, cornrowed hair and a receding hairline. As this is still unsolved, no one is sure the motive, which is why the leading theory is that this is a robbery gone wrong. However, I couldn't find anything on if money was or was not taken. After the police released a sketch of the suspect on February 11th, they got over 24 leads in the first 24 hours. Lane Bryant actually did the right thing as a company, in my opinion, in the aftermath as well. They offered a $50,000 reward for any information leading to the gunman's arrest. They also established the Lane Bryant Tinley Park Memorial Fund in honor of the 5 victims, and offered to pay for all the victims' funerals. I've never heard of Lane Bryant before, but they seem like a good company. It wasn't their fault that these 5 women died, but they did in their store, and the store did everything they could to help out those families. The Burger Chef murders took place at a Burger Chef restaurant in Speedway, Indiana on November 17, 1978. I've also never heard of Burger Chef. A lot of this seems like East Coast things, and I live in Utah. I've never been further east than Denver as of right now, as of time of recording. I've never been further east than Denver, so I've never heard of a lot of these places. Between 11 p.m., which is when the restaurant closed, and midnight on November 17, 1978, 4 employees of the local Burger Chef disappeared. A fellow employee who came by around midnight to say hi noticed that the restaurant was empty. The safe was open, and the back door was cracked open. I know what you're thinking. Why would this employee just show up to say hi? That's kind of suspicious. And if you've never worked a fast food or like a food job, I totally get that you wouldn't understand. But we had employees showing up on their days off after close just to hang around while we closed. So it was pretty normal, at least when I worked in a food job. When police arrived, they found a roll of tape next to the open safe and were told that about $581 was missing. Police initially didn't take it that serious, as the theft was a small amount and there was no clear sign of a struggle, so the initial thought was that the cash was taken by the employees to go partying. When the employees weren't seen after the next day, concern about them began to grow. It became clear that they were in fact not out partying, but had likely been abducted. Real pain struck the town that following Sunday when some hikers found the bodies of all 4 employees over 20 miles away. 2 of the employees had been shot, one had been stabbed, and the fourth had been beaten and choked to death on his own blood. The leading theory is that the four were kidnapped during a botched robbery, possibly after one of the victims recognized one of the perpetrators. One of the employees that was there that night was actually not scheduled to be there, instead covering for someone else. It's possible that this employee was the one that recognized the suspects, since they wouldn't have planned on him being there. An eyewitness saw two suspicious men in a car outside of the restaurant just before closing. Both men were white and in their 30s, one had a beard and the other was clean shaven with light colored hair. Investigators actually believe that they have identified the perpetrators, however, without any physical evidence, they haven't been able to prosecute those who are still alive. Do you want to hear a real conspiracy? Roughly 50% of all my viewers are not subscribed. That's 50% of people, that's half of the people that watch my videos are not subscribed. Go ahead, hit that subscribe button today. On April 17th, 2013, an explosion occurred at the West Fertilizer Company's storage and distribution facility in the city of West in Texas. This explosion happened while firefighters were already responding to a fire at the facility. 15 people were killed, more than 160 were injured, and more than 150 buildings were damaged or destroyed. In 2016, 3 years later, the ATF stated that the fire had been deliberately set, however, that finding has been disputed. At the time of the incident, OSHA, which is the Regulatory Committee for Employee Safety, hadn't inspected the facility since 1985, which if you do the math there is 28 years. As I used to say at a previous job that will remain unnamed, if OSHA isn't here, it's OSHA approved. There isn't a ton of info on this one other than the cause of the fire remains unknown, and legal and forensic experts criticize the ATF investigation, saying that it was set on purpose. They disagree. No one was ever arrested and no suspects were ever named. The Atlanta murders of 1979 to 1981 were a series of murders committed in Atlanta, Georgia, between the years of 1979 and 1981. Over the 2-year period, at least 28 people were killed, including teenagers, children, and adults. Over 100 agents were working on the investigation. The city imposed curfews, and parents removed their children from schools and didn't allow them to play outside. As the media coverage of the killings intensified, the FBI predicted that the killer would dump their next victim into a body of water to conceal any evidence. Police then staked out nearly a dozen bridges and other bodies of water. One night, during a stakeout, an officer heard a splash beneath the bridge, and another officer saw a white 1970 Chevrolet station wagon turn around and drive back across the bridge. The driver? Wayne Williams, a self-purported music promoter and freelance photographer. Now, if this sounds familiar to you, the Netflix series Mindhunter had a series of episodes about this case, so if you've seen Mindhunter, this is why it sounds familiar. While Wayne was arrested and convicted for the murder of 2 people, he professes his innocence to the others and just swears on his life that he's innocent. The police just kind of attributed a lot of the murders to Williams despite no evidence, and the rest of the cases remain essentially unsolved. In the mid-1980s, 3 women disappeared around Claremont, New Hampshire. In 1985 and 1986, the skeletal remains of 2 of the women were recovered within 1,000 feet of each other in a wooded area. The condition of the remains made the cause of death difficult to determine, but there were some factors that pointed to multiple stab wounds. The remains of the 3rd missing woman were found, with evidence again pointing to multiple stab wounds. At this point, investigators started looking at prior homicides in the area and found a couple previous cases of stabbings that reinforced the presence of a serial killer. At the peak of the investigation and after several additional homicides, investigators noticed similar habits, often used dump sites, and specific wound patterns linking many of the murders. There were a couple of suspects and a list of possible other victims, but no one was ever arrested and the list of victims has never been confirmed. The Cleveland torso murderer was a serial killer who was active in Cleveland, Ohio in the 1930s. The victims were dismembered and their remains were disposed of in a neighborhood called Kingsbury Run. Most victims came from the east side of Kingsbury Run, called the Hobo Jungle, known for its bars, gambling dens, brothels, and homeless population. The official number of victims is 12, however, recent research shows that there could be as many as 20. The victims of the murderer were usually drifters whose identities were never determined, but there were some exceptions. Many were people called working poor who had nowhere else to live but in Depression-era shanty towns. The killer always beheaded and often dismembered the victims. In most cases, the cause of death was the decapitation or dismemberment, so they were not dead when the killer was doing their work. At one point, the killer taunted law enforcement by placing the remains of 2 victims in full view of City Hall. The killer would also send the head of law enforcement taunting postcards. The Long Island serial killer is a serial killer who is believed to have murdered between 10 and 18 people over the period of 26 years. Most of the known victims were sex workers who advertised on Craigslist. The victims' remains were found over a period of months between 2010 and 2011 after a police search of the area along the Ocean Parkway near the remote beach towns of Gilgo and Oak Beach in Long Island, New York. The search was started after sex worker Shanann Gilbert had disappeared in the area after a 911 call saying, quote, "They are trying to kill me." She also mentioned that she had just fled from a client's home. Her body was found later into the investigation in December 2011, almost a year after she disappeared. Police claimed she accidentally drowned, while an independent autopsy determined possible strangulation. As you can see here, all the bodies found between 2010 and 2011 were found in this very small 2-mile stretch of land, leading to the possibility and likeliness that they were all killed by the same person or group of people. There is currently a $25,000 reward leading to the capture of the killer or killers, so if you know anything, let me know so I can get that reward. There's not a lot of information on this one, but there is an interesting story, so hopefully you still enjoy this entry. The Frankford slasher is a killer who operated in and around the neighborhood of Frankford in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania from 1985 to 1990. 9 people were killed in total, and police believe the killer was Mr. Leonard Christopher. After a woman by the name of Carol Dowd disappeared, an employee at a local fish market, Leonard Christopher, became a suspect. Police went after Leonard despite the fact that he didn't match the witness's description of Mrs. Dowd being seen with a middle-aged white man before her death. There was also no evidence to link him to any of the other 8 murders, and there was only circumstantial evidence linking him to Dowd's murder in the first place. Despite all of that, he was tried and convicted on 1 count of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. He has since passed due to cancer, but maintained his innocence the whole time. It is also worth noting that the 9th victim was stabbed to death in the same way as the other women, while Leonard was being held without bail on his murder charge. However, detectives said that this couldn't have been the same person because Leonard was in jail, so this must have been a copycat murder. The Highway of Tears is a 450-mile corridor of Highway 16 between the cities of Prince George and Prince Rupert in British Columbia, Canada. This location is where many crimes happen, either missing or murdered people, mostly indigenous women, beginning in 1970. 80+ people have gone missing or have been killed along this stretch of highway. It isn't just one person committing these crimes, but it is interesting that many women, specifically indigenous women, have been targeted along this stretch of road. Possible explanations is that this is a relatively poor area that has some issues, including drug abuse, domestic violence, disruption of the family unit, and low car ownership due to poverty. With the low car ownership due to poverty, hitchhiking is very common along this stretch of highway and often the only way for many to travel far distances for whatever reason. The area is also largely isolated and remote, with soft soil in many areas and carnivorous animals that can carry away human remains. Out of the 80+ victims, 38 have been solved or at least have some sort of update, while everyone else still remains unsolved and unknown. The Texas Killing Fields is a 25-acre patch of land in League City, Texas, about 26 miles southeast of Houston. Since the early 1970s, dozens of bodies of murder victims have been found in this area. The bodies were mostly that of girls or young women. While a lot of remains have been found here, many young girls have disappeared from the area who remain missing. It's believed that many of the murders are the work of multiple serial killers. Most of the victims were aged between 12 and 25 years old. Despite efforts of the local police and the assistance of the FBI, very few of these murders have ever been solved, and those who have been solved were predicated on confessions given by prisoners or confessions given under duress from the police. Remember everyone, always get a lawyer and never ever take a polygraph. There's actually a movie based on this area with the director of the movie calling it the perfect spot to commit and hide a murder. On November 18, 1987, police showed up to the home of Keith Darden, who lived in Illinois in the United States, after he had failed to show up to work that day. There, they found the bodies of his wife and son both brutally beaten. Elaine Darden, who had been pregnant with the couple's daughter, had been beaten so badly that she'd gone into labor, and then the killer or killers also beat the newborn to death. The killings had apparently taken place the day before. Investigators at first believed that Keith was the prime suspect, which I would as well. The next day, however, his body was found in a nearby field. Keith had been shot and his genitals had been mutilated. His car was parked near the police station in Benton. Forensic examination showed that he had been killed within an hour of his family. Residents of the area were already fearful after more than 10 murders had taken place locally in the preceding 2 years, and this did nothing to calm their nerves. Rumors held that the killings were the work of Satanists, but police soon ruled that out as well as other motives, mostly from illicit behavior such as drug dealing, marital infidelity, or gambling. With that said, the crime scene also rules out robbery or forcible sexual assault, and in the absence of any clear cause or leads, this crime remains unsolved. In the small town of Craig, Alaska, one of the most interesting unsolved murders took place. The small city has a population of about 1,300 people and is about 220 miles north of Juneau, the Alaskan capital. On September 7th, 1982, a ship was anchored in a harbor about a mile outside of Craig, which had been discovered to have caught fire. First responders, after putting out the fire, found the charred remains of multiple people. Arson investigators began to look at the crime scene and determined that the fire was no accident. It had been started by someone looking to cover up their crimes. The ship was a 58-foot fishing vessel by the name of the Investor, hence the name the Investor Massacre. The ship was owned and captained by a 28-year-old by the name of Mark. On the journey prior to the fire, Mark had been accompanied by 7 people. They were 4 ship employees, Mark's 2 younger children, and Mark's wife, who was 3 months pregnant. On September 9th, autopsies were performed on 2 of the bodies, and they actually showed signs of having been murdered prior to the fire. Some people also reported to have seen a person buying 2.5 gallons of gas in Craig before making their way to the dock where the investigator was burned. However, the eyewitness accounts of what he looked like differ from person to person, and began to differ even more so as time went on. Honestly, this one could be a video on its own. There's so much information, so if that is something that you'd like all the details on, let me know in the comments and I'll get it added to the content bank. Taking place in an I can't believe it's yogurt shop in Austin, Texas on Friday, December 6, 1991, the Austin Yogurt Shop killings is a quadruple homicide of 4 teenage girls between the ages of 13 and 17. The 4 girls were employees of the shops and were cleaning up after closing time, which was 11 p.m. About an hour before closing, a man was permitted to use the toilet in the back, which took a very long time, which he may have used to jam a rear door open. A couple who left the shop just before closing reported seeing 2 men at a table acting odd. Around midnight, a police patrolman reported a fire at the shop, and first responders discovered the bodies of the girls inside. The girls were not killed in the fire, however, but had been shot in the head and sexually assaulted. A .22 and a .380 were used to commit the murders, and the perpetrators probably exited out the back door that had been found unlocked. The Austin Police Department has DNA from an unknown male as the result of one of the sexual assaults, and a Y chromosome match for a perpetrator has been found in an FBI database. However, it doesn't reveal the identity of the man, as thousands of men have this fragment of DNA, so it's unable to identify individuals, just narrow down the suspect list. The Marcel Bar Massacre is the mass murder of 10 people in a bar in Marseille, France on October 3rd, 1978. 3 armed gunmen entered the bar and shot everyone in the head, with one survivor being the owner's wife, who was in a different room. Police believed the attack was part of a gang war, and the killings were actually compared to the St. Valentines Day Massacre, which I talk about in this video here. The investigative judge in charge of the case was also shot dead on October 21st, 1981. While gang violence is thought to be the reason, no one has ever been convicted, so this still could just be a random act of violence. Do you want to hear a real conspiracy? Roughly 50% of all my viewers are not subscribed. That's 50% of people, that's half of the people that watch my videos are not subscribed. Go ahead, hit that subscribe button today. On July 25th, 1946, 4 young African Americans were murdered by a mob of white men. This is kind of like the OG George Floyd case because it attracted national attention and launched protests across the country. President Harry Truman himself created the President's Committee on Civil Rights, and his administration introduced anti-lynching legislation in Congress, but could not get it past the Southern Democratic bloc. The FBI investigated, which was the first time it had been ordered to investigate a civil rights case, but it was unable to discover sufficient evidence to bring any charges. In the 1990s, publicity about the case led to a new investigation. The state of Georgia and the FBI finally closed their case in December of 2017, again unable to prosecute any suspects. There is now a state historical marker placed in 1999 at the site of the attack. Okay, so when I'm talking about cool names, this is what I'm talking about. Annihilator. Bro, this is such a cool name. Like, supervillains get the name Annihilator. And we're giving real people this name? Real people who kill people get the name Annihilator. And I'm stuck with Cameron. Messed up. The Servant Girl Annihilator, also known as the Midnight Assassin, also cool name, was an unidentified American serial killer who stalked through the city of Austin, Texas between 1884 and 1885. On December 26, 1885, the New York Times reported that, quote, murders were committed by some cunning madman who is insane on the subject of killing women. This was one of the first serial killers in the United States, happening 3 years before Jack the Ripper in Europe. Oddly enough, actually, in 1888, it was brought up that Jack the Ripper and this killer could be the same person. The Oakland County Child Killer is the name given to the perpetrator responsible for the serial killing of at least 4 children in Oakland County, Michigan between 1976 and 1977. 2 boys and 2 girls between the ages of 10 and 12 went missing from outside of their houses. Each child's body was discovered in a public area within 19 days of their disappearance. The children were all strangled or shot, with the 2 boys also having been sexually abused. Once the victims were dead, the killer would disperse their bodies around the county in places where they could be seen from the roadways. The victims were held captive before they were killed, and forensic DNA testing has indirectly implicated 2 suspects, one of whom has since died, and the other is already serving life in prison for offenses against children. The DNA profile created from samples taken from some of the victims' bodies is said to be from a main perpetrator, but does not match the DNA of anyone named in connection with the case, and the identity still is unknown. The Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders were a series of at least 7 unsolved homicides involving female hitchhikers that took place in Sonoma County and Santa Rosa in California in 1972 and 1973. All of the victims were found nude in rural areas, either near steep embankments or in creek beds near roads. There are a few suspects, 2 of which are already infamous. The Zodiac Killer is a suspect due to the similarities between an unknown symbol on his January 29, 1974 letter to the San Francisco Chronicle and the Chinese characters on a missing soy barrel carried by one of the victims. He also said that in the future he would no longer announce to anyone when he commits his murders, and they'll look like routine robberies, killings of anger, or an accident which is faked. Another suspect of the killings is Ted Bundy. He had spent some time in the neighboring Marin County, but was ruled out by a Sonoma County detective in the 1970s and again in 1989. Detailed credit card records and some known whereabouts of Bundy reveal that he was in Washington on the dates of some of the disappearances. However, a 2011 article noted that the dates of the receipts show that there would have been more than enough time for Bundy to make his way down to California, commit the crimes, and then drive back to Washington. He was known to drive hundreds of miles to commit a murder, so it's not out of the question. The Freeway Phantom, another cool name by the way, is the name of a serial killer who murdered 5 young girls and an older woman in Washington, D.C. between April 1971 and September 1972. There have been a number of investigators, and this case has attracted a lot of interest over the years. Numerous tips came in from the public to a hotline operated by the police department of the District of Columbia, and information and tips were also received by mail. All of the leads were investigated to their conclusion, some of which were proven to not be viable, and others required substantial investigation. The practice of the police department at the time was that case files were retained by the detectives assigned to the case. As a result, the case files are incomplete. Some of the files have been discarded entirely, while others are incomplete with pages or pieces of evidence being lost, along with their notes, and all of the investigators who originally worked on this case have long retired, a lot of which are deceased. No leads yet have had enough evidence for prosecution, and a reward of $150,000 is available. The Annecy shootings were the killings of 4 people on September 5, 2012 in France. The attack took place in a lay-by on the Mountainside Road around 3:45 p.m. 25 shots were fired in total. Initial reports stated that only 1 pistol was fired, and the analysis of the cartridge cases showed that the weapon used was actually a Luger P06. The bodies were discovered by a bicyclist shortly after the murders, but he claims he didn't hear the gunshots. However, based on approximate time, he was biking over a bridge and the sound of the rushing water could have drowned out gunshots. In September of 2017, after 5 years of investigation, French police said they have no working theory to explain the murders and no suspect. The lead prosecutor suggested that those killed may have just been targeted randomly. On January 12th of 2022, a man was actually arrested in connection with the murders. Along with his arrest, house searches were conducted and detectives re-examined the alibis of the suspect. However, he was released shortly after, with prosecutors saying that the man had been ruled out as the killer. The Honolulu Strangler is the name of a serial killer and sexual assaulter who is believed to have killed 5 women in Hawaii from 1985 to 1986. The Honolulu Police Department established a 27-person serial task force on September 5th with the help of the FBI. The killer's profile was that he was an opportunist who attacked women who were vulnerable, such as at bus stops. After the 5th victim had been found, police set up roadblocks to question commuters. Witnesses said they had seen a light-colored van and a man with the victim's car. Police arrested Howard Gay on May 9th as the primary suspect. The suspect's ex-wife and current girlfriend described him as a smooth talker. They also noted that he was into bondage, which could be a clue considering that the victims were sexually assaulted. His girlfriend said that on nights they fought, he would leave the house, and these nights are actually the same nights as the murders. Howard, however, was interrogated and eventually released. Police followed him, and a $25,000 reward for information was put out. 2 months after the arrest of Howard, a woman came forward and claimed she saw the victim with a man on the night of the murder. She successfully picked Howard out of a photo lineup as the man, but did not want to be a witness because she believed that he saw her as well. Unfortunately, Howard died in 2003 unprosecuted, so this remains unsolved. The Mayojo 56 building fire was a fire that happened around 1 a.m. local time on September 1st, 2001. September 2001 was a rough month for buildings. The fire burned for 5 hours before it was put out and resulted in the deaths of 44 people and with 3 others injured. It's suspected that the fire was the result of arson, but no suspect was ever arrested. In the aftermath, media coverage, which declined 10 days later due to 2 different buildings collapsing in New York, USA, a video about Osama bin Laden here, focused on the arrest and conviction of the property owners for criminal negligence and on the building's ties to organized crime. The fire started on the 3rd floor of the building. 19 people were on the 3rd floor and 28 were on the 4th floor. The 3 who were injured were 3 employees who jumped out of the building from the 3rd floor and survived, but obviously suffered severe injuries. By the time firefighters got inside to remove the bodies of the 32 women and 12 men from inside the building, the victims were long gone. Police said that the reason the fire was so lethal was due to the numerous violations of fire code, including blocking fire doors and stairwells. 6 people were arrested on charges of professional negligence resulting in death, including the building owner and the commercial tenants of the building. 5 of the people were convicted, but the 6th was acquitted. Tokyo police concluded that the fire was the result of arson, but have not made any arrests in relation to the setting of the fire itself. In 2006, the building was demolished and replaced with a 1-story restaurant. We're on to the last entry, which I kind of said earlier is pretty disturbing, so if you'd like to click away now, go ahead. This is the case of sexual assault of multiple children and murder. So again, if that's not something that you can stomach, feel free to click off. Thank you for watching. I appreciate it. Otherwise, let's get into this last entry. Mr. Cruel, again, a pretty cool name for a killer, especially one this evil, is the name of the suspect of several child sexual assault cases and the suspect of the murder of Carmian Chan in Melbourne, Australia during the late 1980s and early 1990s. There is a reward of 200,000 Australian dollars for the 2 abductions he committed and a $1 million reward for the arrest and conviction of the killer of Carmian Chan. Police described him as highly intelligent, that he meticulously planned each attack, conducted surveillance on the victims and their families, ensured he left no forensic traces, protected his identity by covering his face at all times, and left red herrings to divert family and police attention. He was often soft-spoken and his behavior was unhurried, as he actually took a break during an attack in one of the victims' houses to eat a meal. On August 22nd, 1987, a man wearing a balaclava broke into a family home at 4 a.m. armed with a knife and a handgun. He tied the hands and feet of both parents and locked them in a wardrobe. He then tied their son to a bed and sexually assaulted the 11-year-old daughter. After he was done there, he cut the phone lines and left. On December 27, 1988, he broke into a family home via the back door around 5:30 a.m., wearing the same balaclava and armed with a handgun. He bound and gagged the parents and demanded money. He then grabbed their 10-year-old daughter, put tape over her eyes and a ball gag in her mouth, then abducted her. She was released 18 hours later. On July 3, 1990, he broke into a family home at 11:30 p.m., again armed with a gun and wearing a balaclava. He tied and gagged a 13-year-old girl, placed tape over her eyes, disabled the phone, and searched for money. He then drove to another house and molested the poor girl for 50 hours before releasing her at a power substation. On April 13, 1991, a man wearing a balaclava broke into a family home at around 8:40 p.m. armed with a knife. He abducted 13-year-old Carmian Chan. Her decomposed body was found a year later with 3 gunshot wounds to the head. Police said that there isn't enough evidence to link this crime to Mr. Cruel, however, despite very similar circumstances. The Bande Killers are responsible for a series of violent attacks that mainly occurred in the Belgian province of Brabant between 1982 and 1985. In total, 28 people were killed and 22 were injured. The actions of the group have made this Belgium's most notorious unsolved crime spree. It's believed that the Bande Killers are a group of 3 men, each man having a nickname in the media. The first nickname is The Giant. He was a tall man, believed to be the leader. The second one is The Killer, who was the main shooter. And the third being The Old Man, but he's actually just a middle-aged man who happened to be their driver. Even with witnesses, the identities and whereabouts are unknown. On the early morning of January 1st, 1982, they stole automatic weapons, ammunition, and a car. March 13th, 1982, they stole a 10-gauge shotgun from a store, and 2 men were seen running away. On May 10th, 1982, the gang stole a car, and this was one of 2 instances in which the killer was seen without a mask. The killer spoke French, apparently as a first language, and with the inflection of an educated man. The car they stole, however, was dumped almost immediately. Then, they stole a Volkswagen from a car showroom. In 1982, they had 5 instances of crime. In 1983, the gang committed 12 crimes, including robbery and murder of a taxi driver, armed robbery of a supermarket, another armed robbery of a supermarket with hostages killed, robbery and murder at a textile factory, multiple armed robberies of restaurants, and the killing of a couple who owned a small mom-and-pop shop. 1984 was quiet, but they came back in 1985, where they robbed a supermarket and killed 3 people. The gang then drove to another market 15 minutes after they robbed the first store and killed 5 more people. There are still significant resources dedicated to this case. However, the most recent arrests are the newly retired detectives themselves for alleged evidence tampering. The Blackfriars Massacre occurred on June 28, 1978, in the Blackfriars pub of downtown Boston, Massachusetts. 4 criminals who were known to the police and a former Boston TV news anchorman were killed, allegedly over the sale of cocaine. The perpetrators burst into the pub after it closed for the night. Authorities put the time at around 2 a.m. The men were killed in the middle of a backgammon game that had started up after closing. All 5 men were found in the basement in a pool of blood with gunshot wounds to their head. The corpses were discovered by the janitor when he came in for work the next morning. Investigators suspect that they were surprised at around 2 in the morning and were herded into the basement, which was also the manager's office. There, they were shot by 1 or more intruders wielding at least 1 shotgun and a .25 caliber pistol. At the scene, investigators discovered a small arsenal of firearms and small quantities of cocaine and marijuana, as well as $15,000 in cash in an open safe. It was the drugs and cash that led the police to conclude that the motive behind the massacre was not a robbery, but a classic gang-style slaying. The massacre allegedly was over several kilos of cocaine. One of the murder victims was discovered to have been a close associate of a Winter Hill gang member. On June 20th, 1994, Robin and Margaret Bain and 3 of their 4 children were shot to death in Dunedin, New Zealand. The only suspects were David Bain, who was the eldest son and only survivor, and Robin Bain, the father. David was charged with 5 counts of murder, and in May of 1995, he was convicted on each of those 5 counts and sentenced to mandatory life in prison. His case was later taken up by businessman and former rugby player Joe Karam. In 2007, his legal team successfully appealed the case, arguing that Robin shot and killed his family and then killed himself. David was released on bail in 2007, and the retrial in 2009 ended with his acquittal of all charges. Speculation about this case continued long after David was acquitted, as with David being acquitted, the mystery of who actually killed the family was again a mystery. On the morning of the killings, David Bain returned from his morning paper run and found his family. He called emergency services at 7:09 a.m. in a panic, saying, "They're all dead. They're all dead." When the police arrived, they found the 5 members of the family dead, all having suffered gunshot wounds. A message was found typed into the computer that said, "Sorry, you are the only one who deserved to stay." Do you want to hear a real conspiracy? Roughly 50% of all my viewers are not subscribed. That's 50% of people, that's half of the people that watch my videos are not subscribed. Go ahead, hit that subscribe button today. The AMIA bombing occurred on July 18, 1994 in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and targeted the Argentine Israelite Mutual Association, a Jewish community center. I know what you're thinking. Argentine Israelite Mutual Association, that's AIMA, not AMIA. But in the Argentinian language, the acronym would be AMIA. I just don't know enough about the Argentinian language to pronounce it, so I just put the English pronunciation. This was actually a suicidal attack, and a van filled with bombs was driven into the AMIA building and detonated, killing 85 people and injuring over 300. This still remains the deadliest terrorist attack in Argentinian history. Over the years, the bombings have been marked by accusations of cover-ups. All suspects in the local area were found to not be guilty in September of 2004. In August of 2005, the federal judge who was in charge of the case was impeached and removed from his post on a charge of serious irregularities due to his mishandling of the investigation. On the 25th of October 2006, Argentinian prosecutors formally accused the Iranian government of planning the bombing and the terrorist organization Hezbollah of carrying the bombing out. In 2015, 21 years after the bombing, a 300-page document accused the former Argentine president of covering up Iran's role in the incident. The person who had filed the document was actually murdered hours before he was due to testify against the former president. However, since the document was filed, the case against the former president Kirchner proceeded. In 2021, 6 years after the documents were filed, the case against Kirchner was declared legally null and void. Still to this day, no one has taken credit for this attack, and no arrests have been made. The Monster of Florence is a name given to an unidentified serial killer active in the province of Florence by the Italian media. The killer was active between 1968 and 1985, killing 14 victims, usually young couples secluded in search of intimacy in wooded areas during new moons for maximum darkness. Law enforcement conducted several investigations into the cases over the course of several years. After the murder of the couple in 1982, police leaked false information that one of the victims had regained consciousness before dying in the hospital. Soon after this was leaked, they got an anonymous tip called in to re-look at the murder from 1968, where it was determined that the same gun had been used. In 2017, a freelance journalist conducted an independent investigation that would lead him to find a connection between the Monster of Florence and the Zodiac Killer. So that leads to yet another killer that has links to the Zodiac Killer. The February 9th killer is an unidentified suspected murderer happening right here in Utah. The killer is believed to be responsible for the 2006 murder of Sonia Maya along with her unborn baby and the 2008 murder of Damiana Castillo. The murders were committed on the same day, February 9th, just 2 years apart, hence the name the February 9th Killer. In 2009, the two murders were linked through DNA analysis. The corresponding police departments of Taylorsville and West Valley released a description of the perpetrator as a Hispanic male in his late teens or early 20s. A 20-man task force was then formed to solve the case. In 2012, the case was classified as a cold case. In 2018, the Salt Lake County District Attorney announced that a suspect was in custody in another jurisdiction and was in the process of being extradited back to Utah to face murder charges. In 2022, documents were unsealed and revealed the suspect to be a Mexican national who had previous convictions for fraud in 2008 and was later deported to Mexico until his extradition, which from the latest I can tell has not happened yet, as these are still unsolved. The Jeff Davis 8 refers to a series of unsolved murders in Jefferson Davis Parish, Louisiana. Between 2005 and 2009, the bodies of 8 women were found in swamps and canals in the area. Most of the bodies were found in such a state of decomposition that the cause of death is difficult, if not impossible, to determine. The first victim was found floating in a river by a fisherman on May 20th, 2005. Bodies were then found on a semi-regular basis until the last body was found in 2009 off of Interstate 10. While 2 victims were determined to have their throats slit, the other 6 were too decomposed to find a cause of death. In December 2008, a task force consisting of 14 federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies were formed to solve the killings. the task force was searching for a serial killer. However, recent investigative work exposing connections between victims, suspects, and the police cast doubt on the theory that the Jeff Davis 8 is the work of a serial killer. Family members of the victims, in a twist, actually suspect that the police are responsible for their deaths. Bible John, another cool name in my opinion, is a serial killer believed to have murdered 3 young women between 1968 and 1969 in Glasgow, Scotland. His victims were all young brunette women between the ages of 25 and 32, all of whom had met their murderer at the same dance hall in the city. As this is still unsolved, it is one of the most extensive manhunts in Scottish criminal history. The case would prove to be the first time in Scottish history in which the authorities published a composite drawing of an individual suspected of murder. The killer became known as Bible John due to his having repeatedly quoted from the Bible and condemned any form of adultery while in the company of his victims. More than 100 detectives were assigned full-time to the case, and 50,000 witness statements would be taken in subsequent door-to-door investigations. More than 5,000 potential suspects would be questioned in the first year of the investigation alone. A witness who saw Bible John with her sister the night that she was murdered was brought to over 300 police lineups, where she was adamant that none of the people in the lineups were who she last saw her sister with. And the case has since gone cold. The Tylenol North and Frankenstein murders refer to the deaths of 6 girls who were taken, murdered, and dumped in remote scrub in the Tylenol North and Frankston areas southeast of Melbourne, Australia, between May 1980 and October 1981. Because Tylenol North and Frankston are 2 separate areas, they were initially investigated and treated separately, although the cases were later linked based on case and the similarities of the MO. According to police at the time, all of the victims were on foot, with most of them planning to use public transportation at the time they disappeared. Given the lack of eyewitnesses for anything suspicious, authorities assumed that the victims probably knew or trusted their abductor. Causes of death could not be identified, and most bodies were stripped of their possessions. Around 2,000 interviews were held regarding the case, and later, investigators speculated the possibility of 2 or 3 separate offenders. The prime suspect of this case continued to maintain his innocence and died at the age of 88 in 2020. No one has been charged, and in October of 2017, the police announced 6 separate $1 million rewards for any information that resulted in an arrest for any of the cases. The redhead murders is how the media refers to a series of unsolved homicides of redheaded females in the US between October 1978 and 1992. Now, it is possible that I have color blindness, or maybe these pictures aren't very good, but not all of these women look redhead to me. My brother is a redhead, and this is what I am expecting a redhead to look like, at least the color of their hair. The murders are believed to be the work of a serial killer and occurred in the states of Tennessee, Arkansas, Kentucky, Mississippi, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. The victims were usually women with reddish hair whose bodies were abandoned along major highways in the United States. Officials believe that the women were likely hitchhiking or may have been engaged in sex work. I'm not sure how they think these are related at all, and it seems that the authorities aren't either. Authorities are unsure how many people were responsible for these murders, if they were all performed by the same people or group of people, or even how many victims there may have been total. It's believed that the number of victims could be anywhere from 5 to 14. A possible suspect was pointed out in 1985 when a 37-year-old trucker attacked and attempted to strangle a woman who had reddish hair. He was dismissed in the Redhead murders case, but was convicted of the woman's kidnapping in 1987. Despite his exclusion from the case, it was announced that DNA from him was matched to a victim in 2016. He died in prison in 2015, a year before the findings. A grand jury decided that he would have been indicted for the slaying had he been alive. However, it's not been specified whether he is a suspect in any of the other murders. The Saw Killer of Hanover is an unidentified German serial killer who is supposedly responsible for murdering and dismembering at least 4 women and 2 men. The victims' body parts were found in Hanover and the surrounding areas in the 1970s. None of the killer's victims have been identified. A total of 13 body parts were found between 1975 and 1977, including a severed forearm at a power plant, a lower body in a park, and a torso on a dirt road. On September 26, 1975, the first corpse was found at the hydroelectric power plant near Moxie, a river south of the city center. I'm sorry, I don't know if I pronounced that right. Here's the spelling of it. Volker, if you're watching this video, please let me know if I pronounced that right or how it should be pronounced. The torso of a young woman was found by a worker. The body had probably been in the water for about 14 days. The woman was about 24 years old and about 5'1". The special commission designated the corpse as Torso 1, and they said it was cut with either a circular or bandsaw or a surgical instrument. Despite having the fingerprints examined, authorities could not identify the victim. On December 18th of 1977, the last corpse of the series was discovered on a dirt road near Hanover. The upper body of a 50 to 60-year-old woman was found wrapped in an old cotton blanket. Both her arms and legs had been cut off, and she had strangulation marks around her neck. Many of the victims had a cause of death that could not be determined. They had only been dead for a short time before discovery and were cut up. Where they were only able to find some body parts, the rest of the body parts are still missing. The fact that the murders ended abruptly in 1977 meant to a lot of people that the culprit probably either moved, was jailed for a different reason, or had passed away. The Tube Sock Killings, also known as the Mineral Washington Murders, is a series of murders that occurred in the remote areas of Lewis and Pierce County, New Mineral in Washington State. When couple Steve Harkins and Ruth Cooper left their house for a weekend camping trip on August 10th, 1985, no one thought anything about it. It was pretty normal. However, it was on Monday, when they still had not returned, that people got worried. It was 4 days after their departure, on August 14th, that hikers passing through found the body of Stephen in his sleeping bag, shot in the head. With him still being in his sleeping bag, it was assumed that he had been murdered while he was sleeping. The hikers then found the couple's dog nearby, who had been shot to death. Later, on October 26th, a skull was found near Hearts Lake, which was determined to belong to Ruth via dental records. When they found the rest of Ruth's body, there was a tube sock wrapped around her neck. Over a month after the discovery of Ruth, Mike and his girlfriend Diana, along with their daughter Crystal, left their house to go on a camping trip. Later that night, customers at a Kmart found the couple's daughter standing outside the store entrance. She was placed in foster care until her maternal grandmother saw her photo in the local news 2 days later. When asked where her parents were, she responded with, "Mommy was in the trees," and she was not nearly verbal enough to provide any information. Police searched the area both on foot and by air, looking for evidence of the red 1982 Plymouth pickup truck. On February 18th, 1986, more than 2 months after the couple's disappearance, the body of Diana was discovered half buried in snow by a passing vehicle. Bloodhounds searched the area, but they found nothing. The pickup truck was also found near the body. In the truck, police discovered a handwritten note that said, "I love you, Diana." Diana's mother said that the handwriting was Mike's. The autopsy revealed that Diana had been stabbed 17 times and was found with a tube sock around her neck, just like Ruth. Since they couldn't find Mike, investigators suspected that he may have been responsible for the murder and abandoned his daughter at the Kmart and then fled. They were not able to determine a motive for him, however. Police then theorized that he may have been responsible for both Stephen and Ruth's killings as well. An alternative theory is that he was murdered by the same killer who murdered the others and had just not been found yet. On March 26, 2011, almost 3 decades later, a human skull was found within a mile radius of where Diana's body was found in 1986. The skull was determined to be Mike's, and while a cause of death could not be determined, they could rule out a gunshot wound to the head, as the skull was still intact. The Gypsy Hill killings were a group of 5 homicides of young women and girls in San Mateo County, California in 1976. The killer became known in the media as the San Mateo Slasher. However, it was later proved that there were at least 2 different perpetrators. On January 8, 1976, the body of Veronica Casquillo was discovered in a creek on the grounds of the Sharp Park Golf Course in Pacifica, California. She had been stabbed 30 times, and a homeless person was arrested, but then later released due to lack of evidence. A few weeks later, Tatiana Blackwell was reported missing after leaving her house in Pacifica. Her body was discovered in the Gypsy Hills section of the city on June 6th. She also had been stabbed multiple times. Paula Baxter went missing on Wednesday evening, February 4th, after finishing a play rehearsal at the local high school. Her nude body was found on February 6th in Millbrae behind a Mormon church. She'd been stabbed 4 times, sexually assaulted, and hit on the head with a piece of concrete. On April 1st, 19-year-old Denise Lamp was found dead after a search in the parking lot of the Serramonte Center. She'd been stabbed 20 times. Carol Booth, 26, was reported missing by her husband on March 15th and was discovered in a shallow grave near Colma Creek in the San Francisco area on May 6th. Investigators have connected some of the homicides to each other. All the slain women were young brunettes and most had experienced car trouble prior to being murdered, and all the bodies were found in wooded areas. Since there was a lack of witnesses or forensic evidence, it stalled the investigations. There is some forensic evidence that linked Rodney Halborough to 2 of the murders, and on November 8, 2017, Leon Seymour was charged with the murder of Denise Lamp based on DNA evidence. There was not enough evidence to charge or convict anyone else for the murders of the other girls. The I70 Strangler is the nickname of an unidentified serial killer who murdered at least 12 males in the Midwestern U.S. between 1980 and 1991. All the victims' bodies were discovered in the areas along I70. While this is officially unsolved, it's believed that the now-deceased businessman Herbert Neumeister, a suspect in over a dozen homicides in Indiana, may have been the perpetrator. The killer would choose young boys and adolescents as victims, who he would meet in popular gay bars and similar establishments within a 4-block radius in Indianapolis. All of the victims were found naked or partially clothed near I-70, often dumped in rivers, streams, and ditches in the rural countryside. Each victim had been strangled to death. A task force of 8 officers was created by the Indianapolis police in 1982 to investigate the crimes. Following the discovery of a body in June of 1983, 4 more men were included to the list of potential victims. Like the other victims, they were homosexual, visited gay bars, and were killed in Indianapolis. In 1983, the FBI joined the investigation, with profilers suggesting that the offender showed volatile behavior when committing the murders. Near the end, it was determined that there were at least 2 different perpetrators operating independently of one another. In February of 1998, an Indianapolis resident contacted the police and claimed that Herb Baumeister was photographed leaving the Vogue Theater with one of the victims. Prior to his self-death in 1996, Herb was the prime suspect in the murders of at least 7 men who were killed between 1993 and 1995 in Indianapolis, whose remains were found on his property. After this information surfaced, he was named as the prime suspect in the I-70 Strangler case. According to the investigators, he stopped dumping the bodies of his victims in 1991 after he bought the farm, which he could then use as a burial site for his victims. No physical evidence, however, has ever linked him to the victims. The New Bedford Highway Killer is responsible for the deaths of at least 9 women and disappearances of 2 additional women in New Bedford, Massachusetts between March 1988 and April 1989. The killer is also suspected to have assaulted numerous other women. All the killer's victims were known sex workers or had struggled with addiction. While the victims were taken from New Bedford, they were found in the surrounding towns as well. There were 4 suspects who were investigated, although none of them were convicted for the killings. The victims were Robin Rhodes, Rochelle Daparala, Deborah McConnell, Deborah Medeiros, Christina Montero, Marilyn Cardoza Roberts, Nancy Pava, Deborah DeMello, Mary Santos, Sandra Botello, and Don Mendez, all between 19 and 35. The suspects were Anthony DeGarza, Kenneth Ponte, Daniel Tavers, and the Lisbon Ripper. Anthony was a 26-year-old construction worker. His picture was shown to a locally known sex worker in New Bedford. While she did say that she was assaulted by a man that looked like him, she never identified him as a positive suspect. Kenneth was accused of killing Rochelle. He entered a plea of absolutely not guilty and posted the bond of $50,000. The district attorney later dropped murder charges against him, citing lack of evidence. Daniel was in prison for the murder of his mother and sent a threatening letter to one of the prison staff, indirectly claiming responsibility for the highway killings. It wasn't until 2015 that he was convicted for the murder of Gell. The last suspect, the Lisbon Ripper, was a serial killer in Lisbon, Portugal, who killed sex workers a few years after these killings, in 1992 and 1993. The FBI traveled to Lisbon, and 2 Portuguese police traveled to New Bedford, as both had the idea that these were connected. The I-45 killer is heavily linked to the Texas killing fields, with him dumping the bodies in the fields. So if you want more information on that, you can click here and watch the video that has the Texas killing fields in it. The Chicago Strangler is a serial killer or multiple serial killers believed to be responsible for the deaths of a number of women in Chicago. Since 2001, at least 50 women between the ages of 18 and 58 have been murdered in a similar fashion within the city of Chicago. The victims were predominantly black, typically were prostitutes, and often had previous experiences within the justice system. The victims were strangled, stripped of their clothing, and then left in abandoned areas. The pattern was recognized in 2018 through the Murder Accountability Project, which reviewed over 50 unsolved strangulation cases dating back to 2001. The algorithm used by the project sorts unsolved homicides by location, victim, and killing method in order to identify clusters associated with low homicide clearance rates. According to the project, these factors could be indicative of an active serial killer. Following pressure from activists, the Chicago Police Department announced their review of 51 unsolved murders of women. They claimed that there was no evidence that a serial killer was responsible for any of the 51 killings. Personally, to me, Chicago has a high homicide rate, it has a large African American community, and prostitutes are some of the easiest people to get away with murder. I mean, it's sad, but it's true, because oftentimes they don't really have anyone looking out for them. So I think this is just a case of pareidolia, right? Seeing patterns where there isn't any real patterns. The Bowerville murders is the name given to the 3 deaths that occurred over 5 months from September 1990 to February 1991 in Bowerville, New South Wales, Australia. All the victims were Aboriginal and disappeared after parties in the community in the area known as the Mission. A local day laborer was the prime suspect and was charged with 2 of the murders but was acquitted. There were similarities between the murders that led the police to believe that they were committed by the same killer. They all took place within that 5-month time frame. All 3 are Aboriginal, they all suffered trauma to the head, and they all disappeared after parties within the community. There is, unfortunately, no other information on this case. The Alphabet murders are a series of child murders which occurred between 1971 and 1973 in Rochester, New York. All 3 victims were 10 or 11, and their last name began with the same letter that their first name began with. Carmen Colon, Wanda Walkowitz, and Michelle Menza. They were all found sexually assaulted and murdered by strangulation, and their bodies were discarded in a nearby town or village near Rochester, also with the name beginning with the same letter as the victim's name. So Carmen was found in the city of Churchville, Wanda was found in Webster, and Michelle was found in Macedon. All 3 murders generated intense public outrage and had much publicity. Following the murder of Michelle, investigators released a composite drawing of the individual seen with the child by numerous witnesses to the media. They also had a telephone hotline devoted to the manhunt for the perpetrator, who they strongly suspected had committed all 3 murders. Anonymity was offered to any caller offering information, and a reward was offered for any information leading to the arrest and conviction of the perpetrator. These efforts resulted in numerous calls from the public, but no credible suspect was located. The teardrop rapist is responsible for 35 sexual assaults on women, including minors, in Los Angeles, California. The assaults began in 1996 and continued through 2012. He's believed to be a Hispanic male with a light complexion and at least 1 teardrop tattoo under his eye. The perpetrator was thought to have stopped his assaults in 2005, but in November of 2011, a 15-year-old girl was attacked and DNA evidence was linked to the same person. However, the 15-year-old victim did not see the tattoo that many of the previous victims had, perhaps due to tattoo removal. After an attempted assault on June 5, 2012, police announced plans to canvass the Hispanic neighborhoods of LA and offered a $50,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. On July 27, 2013, LAPD announced their collaboration with the FBI and increased the reward to $100,000. They also released a new set of composite sketches. Here's the composite sketch, and here's the physical characteristics of the man authorities believe committed these crimes. Hispanic male, brown hair, 5'2" to 5'6", 130 to 170 pounds, may have a teardrop tattoo or some type of scar underneath an eye if it was removed, and most likely between 40 and 55 if still alive. If you have any information regarding this one with it being so recent, contact LA Police at 213-486-1000. The Oklahoma Girl Scout murders took place on the morning of June 13, 1977 at Camp Scott in Mayes County, Oklahoma, United States. The victims were 3 Girl Scouts between the ages of 8 and 10 who were raped and murdered. Their bodies were left on a trail leading to the campsite showers about 150 yards from their tent. The case was classified as solved when a local jail escapee with a history of violence and was arrested. However, he was acquitted in March 1979 after a jury unanimously returned a verdict of not guilty. Less than 2 months before the murders, during an on-site training session, a counselor at the camp discovered that her belongings had been ransacked and her donuts had been stolen. Inside the empty donut box was a handwritten note stating in all capital letters, "We are on a mission to kill 3 girls, intent 1." The director of the camp session treated the note as a prank and it was discarded. However, on the morning of June 13th, a camp counselor was on her way to the shower when she saw a girl's body in her sleeping bag in a wooded area outside of the tent area. It was discovered that all 3 girls from Tent 7 were missing. As counselors began searching, they discovered the girls from Tent 7 had been murdered. 2 bodies were inside sleeping bags, crumpled towards the bottom of the bag, and 1 body was visible on the outside. They'd been left on a trail leading to the showers about 150 yards from their tent. Subsequent testing showed that they had been bludgeoned and strangled. A large red flashlight was found on top of the girls' bodies, and a smudged fingerprint was found on the lens, but it has never been identified as it was too smudged for a positive identification. A footprint of a 9.5 size shoe was also found in the blood in the tent. Between 2:30 and 3 a.m. on June 13th, a landowner reported hearing quite a bit of traffic on a remote road near the camp. Camp Scott was evacuated and later shut down. This one especially is really creepy to me. I used to go on campouts when I was in Scouts. I was in the Boy Scouts as a kid. I used to go on campouts, and I was always afraid of something or someone in the woods breaking into my tent. It was always something I feared. Anytime I went camping, I probably got 2 or 3 hours of sleep at most, and it wasn't consecutive. It was 15 minutes to a half hour every couple hours. So this one spooks me just thinking about. I can't imagine waking up one morning and hearing that there were dead bodies found and they'd been murdered. I don't even know what I would probably need counseling or something. I don't know. I would just stop talking to anyone. I would never do anything, and I would never leave my room, which I already don't do that. I already don't talk to a lot of people. I already don't leave my room. My social anxiety is just very high, but I imagine if this happened, it would just be way worse. So I don't know, man. This one just really got to me when I was researching it, and even right now, I'm a little creeped out about it. The Stone Man is the name of a serial killer in Calcutta, India. He killed at least 13 homeless people in 1989. The name was also given to a perpetrator of a similar series of murders in Mumbai from 1985 to 1988. It's been speculated that these are in fact the same person, so it's possible that he could be responsible for as many as 26 murders. With the Mumbai killings being first, we'll cover them first. Starting in 1985 and lasting for about 3 years, a series of 12 murders were committed in Mumbai. The killer or killers would find an unsuspecting victim, usually a homeless person, sleeping alone in a desolate area. The victim's head was then crushed with a single stone weighing as much as 30 kilograms or 66 pounds. In most cases, the victims' identities could not be determined since they slept alone and did not have relatives or coworkers who could identify them. Since the victims were homeless and the crimes were not high profile, it was difficult to get any information. It wasn't even until the 6th murder that the Mumbai police began to see a pattern in the crimes. A homeless waiter survived one of the attacks and managed to escape and report it to the police. However, since the area was dimly lit where he was sleeping, he was not able to get a good look at the attacker. In the middle of 1988, the killings suddenly stopped. It's never been confirmed if the Calcutta and the Mumbai killer are the same person. However, the similarity in weapon, choice of victims, execution of crime, and the time of the attack suggests that the killer was at the very least familiar with the Mumbai killer, if not the killer himself. The first victim in Calcutta died from injuries to the head in June of 1989. 12 more murders attributed to the Stone Man were reported within the following 6 months. All of the murdered were homeless people who slept alone in the dimly lit areas of the city. Because the murderer killed victims by dropping a heavy stone or concrete slab onto their head, the police assumed that the killer was probably a tall, well-built male. However, since no one has ever seen the killer, there is no confirmed physical attributes. Police were deployed to various parts of the city, and a number of people were arrested. After a handful of arrests were made, the killings stopped. However, all the suspects were released back into the public due to lack of evidence. The Tokyo Metropolitan Murders refers to a series of unsolved murders between 1968 and 1974 in the greater Tokyo area. The killer would attack and rape women living alone who he killed at midnight, then would burn their corpses. Most of the victims were in their 20s. In total, 9 cases were recorded and another 2 were thought to be linked due to the similarity of the crimes. A 37-year-old construction worker named Etsu Ono was arrested on suspicion of theft, and he was linked to all 10 of the killings. At a trial, he was sentenced to life in prison, but later he was subsequently acquitted of the murder and released from prison. At this point, the statute of limitations on these killings has expired. The Sewer Murders are a series of murders against male teenagers in Germany during the 1970s and 80s, specifically 1976 to 1983. The victims were 7 boys between 11 and 18 from Frankfurt, where some of them may have worked as prostitutes when they met their killer. The boys' hands were tied behind their back with a rope and then killed by blunt force. For some of the boys, their fate was met via drowning in the sewage. Due to the amount of time in the sewage, the victims were not able to be identified right away, if at all. On September 7th, 1976, an unidentified male was found wearing only socks near a hiking trail during a military drill. The body was determined to have been there for at least 6 weeks, and a skull fracture had been found to be the cause of death. Since the identity could not be determined, the police assumed that he was a foreigner. On May 23rd, 1982, a body was found behind a sewage inflow. The body had significant damages and was probably laying there for over 6 months, and the cause of death could not be determined. On September 19th, 1982, a collection scoop at the sewage plant was blocked by a body. Odds are that he was still alive when he was thrown into the manhole and most likely drowned. On July 2nd, 1983, a body was found in the sewage of a sewage plant. His hands were handcuffed, but there was no external injuries visible. On September 9th, 1983, the body of a 14-year-old Moroccan boy was found in a sewage treatment plant. At first, the police assumed that he had drowned accidentally, but then it became clear that he had been murdered. On October 11th, 1983, the youngest victim, 11 years old, was found at the sewage treatment plant. He had leg cuffs on his body and was pushed into a manhole. He had run away from home and was never seen alive again. On June 21st, 1989, the last body was found in a drainage system. Only bones and pieces of clothing were found, as he'd been missing since 1983, 6 years earlier. The Father's Day Bank Massacre was a bank robbery and killing that happened on June 16, 1991 in Denver, Colorado. The perpetrator killed 4 unarmed guards and held up the 6 tellers in the bank's cash vault. The United Bank Tower had allowed its guards to be armed, but had actually changed their policy less than a year before the robbery, requiring the guards to be unarmed. At about 4 a.m. on the day of the massacre, an alarm went off in the basement storage room of the tower. Records showed that a guard in the control center turned off the alarm and didn't take any further action. While this is suspicious, it is unknown if it had anything to do with the robbery. At 9:14 a.m., a man identifying himself as Robert Bardwell, a vice president at the bank, asked for entry through a side freight elevator. He called the bank's guard room using a security phone. A guard responded by riding the elevator up from the guard room. When the elevator door opened, the gunman forced the guard to ride to the sub-basement area of the bank. There, the guard was killed and his body was hidden in the storage room. The killer then made his way through the bank tunnels and up a floor to the bank's basement level, where the vault and the guard stations were. Once he entered the guard room, he forced 2 guards into a battery room where he shot and killed both men. Investigators believe that a 3rd guard returned to the area during or right after the shooting, and upon the guard's return, he was shot several feet away from the room where the other 2 guards lay. Before leaving the guard room, he took 10 videotapes that had his identity, bank keys, a 2-way radio, and the guard logbook as a way to eliminate any trace of him. He then went to a vault where 6 employees were on duty doing cash deliveries. He demanded that the employees cover their eyes and lay on the floor. He then ordered the senior vault manager to fill a satchel with cash from the workstations. Then he forced the tellers to crawl into a small room near the vault, which he locked. Prior to leaving the scene, the robber collected the shell casings that had expelled from the gun. The only evidence he left behind at all were the 18 bullets that he fired. The bank employees said the man appeared to be in his late 50s or 60s, wore a gray sports coat, a white shirt, a multicolored necktie, a brown fedora, and mirrored sunglasses. About $200,000 was stolen. About 3 weeks later, retired police officer James King was arrested. The jury, however, acquitted him, and none of the stolen money was ever found. Charlie Chopoff is the name of an unidentified serial killer known to have killed 4 children between 1972 and 1973. On March 9, 1972, 8-year-old Douglas Owens was found dead, stabbed 38 times. His genitals had been cut, but not severed from his body. On April 20th, another youth was repeatedly stabbed, and his genitals were severed from his body, although he survived his injuries. On October 23rd, Wendell Hubbard was stabbed to death on the roof of a tenement block, and his genitals had also been severed from his body. On March 6, 1973, a 9-year-old boy by the name of Luis Ortiz was stabbed 38 times and also had his genitals mutilated. Lastly, on August 17, 1973, 8-year-old Stephen Cropper was repeatedly slashed with a razor on the roof of a tenement block. He bled to death from an injury to his arm, although his genitals were left intact. There is a suspect by the name of Erno Soto. He was arrested on May 15, 1974, but was an intermittent patient at the Manhattan State Hospital since 1969. The surviving victim said that Soto looked like his attacker, but he could not positively ID him. Despite lack of evidence, investigators still believe that he is a likely suspect, citing the fact that the murders ceased after his arrest. Due to lack of evidence and his acute mental instability, he, however, did not stand trial. The Sleepy Hollow Killer is an unidentified South African rapist and serial killer thought to be responsible for the rapes and murders of at least 13 women. He would strangle his victims using their panties, which is the way that 3 more women were actually killed in 2007, possibly by the same killer. In the late 1990s, several women were raped and strangled with their own panties, and their bodies were found near the N3 highway. In 2001, authorities began an investigation into the murders, exhuming 7 of the women's corpses from graves in an attempt to identify them through facial reconstruction. The investigation led nowhere, and it closed that same year. But between February and October of 2007, the bodies of 3 women were found again near the N3 highway. Like the 1990s victims, they were raped and strangled to death with their own panties, with the only difference being that they were severely burned after their death. There was only one possible suspect, a 32-year-old man, but when questioned, the superintendent of the case said that he did not believe that he was linked to the victims of the Sleepy Hollow Killer. Back to Denver, the Denver prostitute killer is responsible for the murder of at least 17 women in Denver between 1975 and 1995. The killings were grouped together in 2008, and until then, each of these crimes were considered to have been committed by a different person. The killer chose young girls and women aged 15 to 25 for his victims. A common pattern was for them to be hitchhikers or to have visited bars or fast food restaurants, and a majority of them being engaged in prostitution. The victims were beaten and strangled, and their bodies were dumped along I-70. Some of the bodies were posed in humiliating positions. While this remains unsolved, a 2005 DNA profile pointed to a 52-year-old Billy Reed. Billy had previously been arrested and charged with 2 separate murders. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. No evidence incriminating him has ever been located except for the trace amounts of DNA that points to him, so these do still remain unsolved. The Wednesday Strangler is a Japanese serial killer responsible for the murder of 7 women in the Sage Prefecture from 1975 to 1989. The nickname comes from the fact that 6 of the 7 victims disappeared on a Wednesday. Between 1975 and 1989, 7 murders occurred within a 20-kilometer radius, all of which the victims vanished during the evening or night. 5 of the deaths were due to strangulation, but the remaining 2 victims were just skeletons when they found them, and their cause of death couldn't be determined. On August 27, 1975, a 12-year-old student disappeared and was found on June 27, 1980, in a toilet stall next to the elementary school pool. On April 12, 1980, a 20-year-old also disappeared in the same way as the previous victim. She was also found in the elementary school bathroom. Hers was the only murder to not have taken place on Wednesday. On October 7, 1981, a 27-year-old disappeared and was found strangled to death in a vacant lot. On February 17, 1982, an 11-year-old was strangled to death while walking home from school. On July 8, 1987, a 48-year-old restaurant employee disappeared mysteriously. She was found dead on the 27th of January, 1989, beneath a cliff. On December 7, 1988, a 50-year-old housewife disappeared, and on January 25, 1989, a 37-year-old office worker also disappeared. The previous 2 were found beneath the cliff, with the third one. The Family Murders is a name given to a series of 5 murders in Australia, speculated to have been committed by a connected group of individuals known as the Family. Police believe that up to 12 people were involved in the killings. A cold case review was opened on March of 2008 with a $1 million reward available for anyone who provided information leading to a conviction. The victims are as follows. Alan Barnes, 16, murdered in 1979. He was last seen while hitchhiking. His body had been severely mutilated and dumped in the South Para Reservoir. A post-mortem examination revealed that Barnes had died from massive blood loss from an anal injury, likely caused by the insertion of a large blunt object. Neil Murr, 24, murdered in August of 1979, had been dissected and cut into many pieces, placed in a garbage bag, and thrown into the Port River. Most of his body parts had been placed in a garbage bag and then placed into his abdominal cavity. The head was tied to the torso with a rope passing through the mouth and out through the neck. He'd also died of massive blood loss from an anal injury. Peter Stogneff, 14, murdered in August of 1981, was found in October of 1982 by a local farmer. His body had been cut into 3 pieces in a similar fashion to Neil. Little more could be determined as the remains had accidentally been burnt by the farmer while he was burning the scrub off his property. Mark Langley, 18, murdered February of 1982, was found in scrub in the foothills 9 days after his disappearance. Among the mutilation was a wound that appeared to have been cut with a surgical instrument that went from his navel to his pubic region, and part of his small bowel was missing. Similar to the other 2 whose cause of death could be determined, he had died from massive blood loss from anal injuries. Lastly, Richard Kelvin, 15, murdered July of 1983, was abducted a short distance from his home on June 5th, and he was found on July 24th by a geologist who was searching for moss-covered rocks. He'd been held captive for approximately 5 weeks, and he had also died from massive blood loss from an anal injury. The Skid Row stabber is responsible for the murders of 11 people in the LA neighborhood known as Skid Row, which is known to have a large homeless population. His weapon of choice was a knife. The murders began on October 23, 1978. As victims, the killer chose the homeless, whose corpses were dumped in the alleyways of various streets located close to each other. During the investigation, there were witnesses found that had seen a murder take place. According to the witnesses, the criminal was a 30-year-old black man who spoke with a Puerto Rican accent and introduced himself as Luther. In January of 1979, the inscription, "My name is Luther, I kill winos, I put them out of their misery," was found in the bathroom of the LA Terminal bus building. In December of 1978, a man named Bobby Maxwell showed deviant behavior against sleeping homeless people and was arrested on charges of disturbing public order. A knife was seized from him during his arrest. While he was in prison, the Skid Row stabber didn't commit any murders, and he was subsequently arrested again on suspicion of murder in April of 1979. Despite the fact that there was no material evidence found in any of the other murders, the public blamed all of the murders on Maxwell, and he was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. Decades later, in 2017, Maxwell suffered a massive heart attack, which caused him to fall into a coma. In a new trial, the LA prosecutor's office dropped all charges against Maxwell, and in October 2018, he was found not guilty, which his conviction and prison sentence were ruled as a miscarriage of justice. He died in April 2019, never regaining consciousness after his heart attack, and was never made aware of his not guilty verdict. As such, the real identity of the Skid Row stabber remains unknown. The House Jarvie Gravel Pit Murders is a series of 2, 3, or maybe even 4 murders that are connected to a gravel pit in the House Jarvie municipality in Finland, about an hour north of the country's capital. The first person associated with this killer is someone by the name of Helena. She left her friend's apartment around midnight and was waiting for her train on the platform when a dark-haired man approached her. The man asked where she was going, and she told him she was headed to a nearby city, in which he offered her a ride in his car. Since she was drunk, she agreed. The man then drove to a dark gravel pit and stopped the car. He tried to persuade her to spend the night in the car, but she refused and said that she wanted to go home. At this point, the man told her that he needed to urinate and left the car. Helena also said, "You know what, I also kinda gotta go potty." So she squatted outside the car, and the man struck her in the back of the head with the blunt end of a knife. Lucky for Helena, she was actually wearing a woolen cap that cushioned the blow, and she managed to get up and run into the nearby forest. Eventually, she got help at a nearby house. While she was running, she said that she heard the man say something about things not having worked out this time and returning to his car. His alleged second victim is a woman named Tula, who left a psychiatric hospital in order to attend a meeting about her son's custody case. However, she never arrived to that meeting. The next day, her body was discovered by a villager when he went to inspect the damages caused by the blizzard from the night before. According to police, time of death was around midnight, and she had suffered many injuries. Her body was found less than 100 meters from the gravel pit where Helena was taken. Next was Marit. She disappeared in August of 1993 and was never seen again. Due to the circumstances and location of her disappearance, police believe that the same person was responsible for her disappearance. Her body or person has never been found, and the investigation remains open today. In 2017, the media published that a possible fourth case was uncovered. In 1989, a drunken 30-year-old woman had just exited a restaurant when a man offered her a ride. The woman was also driven to a forest near a gravel pit and was able to escape. This hadn't come out to the authorities until her mother brought it up years later, after this fourth woman had passed away of natural causes. Okay, so super long name, but the 1998 abduction of 4 engineers in Chechnya is the abduction of 4 UK-based specialists by unidentified Chechnyan gunmen. On the night of October 3rd, 1998, a heavily armed group of Chechnyan-speaking men captured the 4 foreign workers from their home in Grozny, which is actually, ironically enough, right next to the headquarters of the Chechen security team assigned to fight the plague of kidnappings in the area. The group of engineers had bodyguards, and the attackers actually fought a short gun battle with one of them, but he was only lightly armed. The nearby anti-kidnapping task force did not respond or react to the shooting in any way because they said they were not aware that foreigners were at that house and gunfire was frequent in the city at night. All of the law enforcement agencies of the Chechnyan Republic got involved in the search for the victims. On the upside, more than 60 hostages were released as officials raided the homes of suspects, but the engineers were not found. On October 8th of that year, a spokesman for Chechnya's security ministry said that they were probably alive and well, but the kidnappers had not set demands for their release. After nearly 2 months, at the end of November, the kidnappers called Granger Telecom, which is where the men worked, promising that the hostages were alive and well, and they demanded a ransom of $10 million. The British government already announced that it was their policy not to pay ransoms, but Granger Telecom agreed to find the money. However, on December 8th, the engineers' heads were found in a sack on the side of the highway and were identified by one of the bodyguards. In a press conference on December 10th, Chechnya's vice president showed a recovered videotape in which the kidnappers forced the four to dress in military uniforms and confess in Russian to spying for German, English, and Israeli special services as well as the CIA. According to Chechen security forces, they were executed at an unused factory after a failed rescue attempt, and it was suggested that their death was a show of defiance to the authorities from the kidnappers. Family members of the engineers said that the failed rescue attempt ruined delicate negotiations that were going on between Granger and the kidnappers. Their bodies were found on December 29th and exhumed to the UK. According to officials, the men were starved of food and water, repeatedly beaten, and finally decapitated with a large knife. There have been some suspects, but no one has ever been tried for these crimes. Okay, so the Leathers Oil Company murders is only technically unsolved. There is an accused person, but they've been in hiding since 1994 and not found, so no one's ever been convicted, so it's technically unsolved, so we're going to cover it. Tyrone Tice, a 20-year-old station manager at the Leathers Oil Company gas station in Gresham, Oregon, was fired on August 31st, 1993, after allegedly stealing $30 from the station. After he had been fired, he actually returned the stolen money and formally apologized, but was not given his job back. On the morning of January 17, 1994, a customer entered the gas station and discovered the bodies of 3 employees, Virginia Endcott, Rosaline Faye Gertz, and Mary Carey. Law enforcement said that about $9,000 was missing, and they believed that the victims had been taken into the storage garage at gunpoint, ordered to lay face down on the floor, and each shot in the back of the head execution style. A break in the case came the next month, on February 10, 1994, when an informant called law enforcement with a lead. Law enforcement received the name Tyrone Tice about 2 days after that, and his apartment was searched by law enforcement. On February 16th, a county judge signed an arrest warrant accusing Tice of 3 counts of aggravated murder, but law enforcement were unable to locate him. A federal warrant was then issued the following day, claiming that he had fled to Idaho to avoid prosecution. His friend, Lori Stevens, and cousin, Lawrence Scherf, were questioned by law enforcement. Lori was then arrested and charged with felony murder for driving the getaway vehicle from the crime scene, and Lawrence, who was also in the vehicle, was arrested 2 days later. According to Lori's husband, she had driven both men to the gas station on the morning of the murders, but was unaware that Tice intended to rob the station. Lori and Lawrence remained in the vehicle while Tice entered, then exited the station. Despite this, Lori pleaded guilty to her charges on October 18th, 1994. Both Lori and Lawrence were convicted and served 10 years in prison for their roles in the murders. As part of the plea bargain for reduced prison sentences, they both agreed to testify against Tice when he's brought to trial. However, his whereabouts still remain unknown. According to a 2011 profile of the case by America's Most Wanted, law enforcement assumes that Tice is still alive and possibly still in the USA under false identity. As mentioned earlier, this one is all but solved, as once Tice is found, he will almost certainly be found guilty. The Wall Street bombing took place at 12:01 p.m. on Thursday, September 16, 1920. The explosion killed 30 people immediately and injured 10 others who later died from their wounds. There were also 143 seriously injured, and the total number of injured was in the hundreds. That day, a horse-drawn wagon stopped across the street from the headquarters of J.P. Morgan Bank on the financial district's busiest corner. Inside the wagon, 100 pounds of dynamite with 500 pounds of heavy cast iron weights exploded via timer-set detonation, which caused the cast iron weights to tear through the air. The horse and wagon were both blasted into small pieces, but somehow the driver was seen by witnesses leaving the wagon and running down the street. The bomb caused more than $2 million in damage at the time, which is about $30 million in today's money. The Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor to the FBI, did not immediately conclude that the bomb was an act of terrorism. They were puzzled by the number of innocent people killed and the lack of a specific target other than the building that was damaged, but only with superficial wounds, not any structural damage. Cruis cleaned up the area overnight to allow for normal business the next day, but the police hadn't had time to thoroughly investigate the area yet, so the crews inadvertently destroyed physical evidence that might have helped solve the crime. A group called the Sons of the American Revolution had previously planned a patriotic rally for the next day to celebrate Constitution Day at the exact same intersection. That day, thousands of people attended the celebration in defiance of the previous day's attack. That right there kind of gives me goosebumps, and is something that I think the USA does extremely well. A lot of Americans kind of have the revolution is my birthright gene in their blood from the Revolutionary War, and something like this kind of shows that it doesn't matter if you want to try and attack or intimidate us, we will rally with each other in an act of defiance, because there's nothing Americans love more than defiance. The investigation stalled when they looked at the victims and none of them were the driver of the wagon. The horse also had new shoes put on, but they couldn't locate the stable that did the work. Now this next part's kind of like funny. I think it's so funny. So police questioned tennis champion Edwin Fisher, who had sent warning postcards to his friends telling them to leave the area before September 16th, September 16th being when the bomb went off. When questioned, he told police that he received the information through the air, and they later found that he made a regular habit of mailing out these warnings. As such, they had him committed to an asylum where he was diagnosed as insane but harmless. Imagine you send out letters all the time telling people to leave areas, and one time it comes true, and now because of it you're living the rest of your life in an asylum. Absolutely crazy. Investigators believe this was carried out by Gallianists, who are a group of people who follow insurrectionary anarchist Luigi Galliani, and they were responsible for a series of bombings the year prior. However, there have still been no convictions made in this case. The Thames Torso Murder is a sequence of unsolved murders of women occurring in London, England from 1887 to 1889. Only one of the 4 victims has ever been identified, but none solved. The media speculated connections between this killer and Jack the Ripper as they were happening at the same time. However, police said that they were in fact 2 different killers. There were also murders that happened very similarly that could have been this killer, but it's not confirmed to be connected. Those happened between 1873 and 1902. The 4 that this killer has ties to for sure are called the Canonical 4. As mentioned earlier, only one of the victims were identified, so let's talk about the Canonical 4. The first person on the list is the Rainham Mystery. Between May and June of 1887, the remains of a woman's body were found in the River Thames near Rainham. Workers first found a bundle with a torso of a female, and throughout May and June they found various parts of the same body, but never found the head or upper chest. Doctors could not find the cause of death, but said that a degree of medical knowledge had to be needed to perform the dissection. Next is the Whitehall Mystery. Between September 11th and October 17th of 1888, the dismembered remains of a woman were discovered at 3 different sites in the center of the city. The torso was matched to a right arm and shoulder that had been previously found on a muddy river shore. Later, with the help of a dog, the police found a left leg buried near a construction site. The third case is the only one to have ever been identified. Her name was Elizabeth Jackson, and her torso was found in the Thames on June 4th, 1889. Eventually, the left leg, lower part of the abdomen, the liver, the upper part of the body, the neck and shoulders, the left foot, the left arm and hand, the buttocks, pelvis, and right arm and hand were all found. It was concluded that she was pregnant at the time of the murder, and while her head was never found, the victim was identified as Elizabeth Jackson, a homeless prostitute. The fourth and last of the Canonical 4 is the Pinchin Street Torso Murder. On September 10th, 1889, a police constable found the headless and legless torso of an unidentified woman under a railway arch. Extensive bruising around the victim's hip, back, and arm indicated that she had been severely beaten shortly before her death. Despite an extensive search, no other sections of her body were ever found. National Airlines Flight 967 was a DC-7 aircraft that disappeared over the Gulf of Mexico on its way to New Orleans from Tampa, Florida on November 16, 1959. The last radio contact with the flight was at 12:44 a.m. when the flight contacted New Orleans. Radar operators at a military station picked up the flight at 12:46 a.m. In his last message, the pilot reported a smooth flight and unlimited visibility, but he said that he could see a solid overcast of fog ahead. The flight took a right turn, then disappeared from the radar at 12:51 a.m. At 1:16 a.m., New Orleans attempted to contact Flight 967 but received no response. Attempts by the FAA, the New Orleans Approach Control, and Air Traffic Control were unable to make contact. Search and rescue aircraft spotted scattered debris and a number of bodies in the vicinity of the last radar blip. The remains of 10 individuals were eventually located. The main section of the wreckage has never been found, despite extensive efforts of the Navy and Coast Guard divers. An executive officer of the Coast Guard stationed at New Orleans said that the plane might have exploded when it accidentally flew too low and struck the water. He also mentioned that the passengers apparently had no warning, as only one life preserver was found among the debris. However, a Pennsylvania paper speculated that the aircraft may have been brought down by a bomb, mentioning that the search team believed there was an explosion but didn't agree about when or why it occurred. A hypothesis arose that one passenger, William Taylor, who had befriended a convicted criminal, Robert Spears, boarded the plane with a piece of luggage that contained a bomb. William boarded the flight using a ticket issued to Robert. When the aircraft was destroyed, authorities assumed that Robert had been a victim and that his wife would be able to collect on his giant life insurance. However, William purchased life insurance in his own name at the airport right before the departure. It was when his ex-wife applied to collect the money that the substitution of William for Robert was discovered. Robert disappeared after the accident and was found in Phoenix, Arizona with William's car. There was never any evidence found connecting him to the accident, however. All 42 people on the flight are presumed dead. Another flight, National Airlines Flight 2511, was a U.S. flight from New York to Miami, Florida. The airplane, a DC-6, exploded in midair in 1960. There were 29 passengers and 5 crew on board, and all 34 people died. The crew checked in with the Wilmington Airport at 2:07 a.m. and later reported flying over the Carolina Beach radio beacon at 2:31 a.m. This was the last radio contact with the airplane. After losing contact with the aircraft, the U.S. Coast Guard and Navy began an intensive search along the southeastern coast of the U.S. The search was called off the following day, however, when National Airlines received word that there was a plane down in North Carolina. At about 2:45 a.m., a farmer heard the sound of an engine cutting in and out, followed by the tearing of metal and then an explosion. Later that morning, after his teenage son found an airplane wreckage in their fields, the farmer drove to Bolivia, North Carolina, which had the nearest phone. He called the Wilmington airport to report to the downed plane at approximately 7 a.m. The most likely explanation of the explosion was a suicide bombing due to substances found on one of the passengers, Julian Frank. Much like the last entry we talked about, Julian had a giant life insurance policy on him, and it's believed that with the life insurance and the odd substances found on his person, that he's the person responsible for the explosion, but it has never been confirmed. Okay, so this entry is going to be short. The 1933 United Airlines Boeing 247 mid-air explosion. It's just like the previous two. The plane exploded mid-air. No one's sure who's responsible. All 7 people on board were sadly killed. Tammy Cooper, who was 45 years old, moved from Dallas, Texas to Lubbock, Texas in hopes of a fresh start. This raised some red flags for her close friend, Carla Mann, as it seemed that on the outside, her life was good for her and her 3 kids, Mahogany, Cadice, and Kashim Allen. However, this fresh start was never to be, as on October 24, 2004, police were called to her apartment in East Lubbock where they found all 4 of them dead. They were badly beaten, cut, and fatally stabbed with items believed to have been from the kitchen. There were signs of a struggle, and it's believed that Tammy fought tooth and nail to try and protect her kids. It was later discovered that a friend of Tammy's was on the phone with her around the time of the murders. The friend stated that they heard a loud knock on Tammy's end of the phone, followed by a deep male voice saying, "Get off the phone, get off the phone, we need to talk." Tammy responded with, "How did you find me?" The friend on the phone asked Tammy who it was, and Tammy said that she wouldn't know him. The suspect is suspected to be someone she knows, as the friend described her tone as being normal with no panic in her voice. She told her friend that the guy's name was Butch and that he was a burly black individual, then hung up the phone. The identity of Butch has never been found. But who is Butch? It seems like he knew her from her life in Dallas, and she actually probably moved to avoid him. She left a good life in Dallas for seemingly no reason, and then suddenly after she moved, this Butch character shows up, and then they're found dead. What's the motive? What does Butch have against Tammy and her kids? The world may never know. The Stolero Yachman Chalks affair refers to a series of 3 unsolved murders that took place in Israel in the early 1960s. Between November 1962 and July of 1963, 3 murders took place in central Israel. While the victims were not connected, the cases themselves were very similar. The killer, who had no apparent motive, gunned down the victims with an Uzi submachine gun, then would immediately flee the scene. The first victim was Moshe Stolara, a 32-year-old disabled man who owned a household goods, book, and newspaper store. He lived with his parents in an apartment in the same building where his store was located. On November 15, 1962, around 7 p.m., he had closed and locked up his shop and was returning home. A gunman fired at him with an Uzi while he was in the stairwell of the building. He was hit 3 times and unfortunately killed. Nothing was stolen from his store and there was no attempt to break in, leading police to believe that the murderer's sole intention was to kill him. The second victim was Dr. Shmuel Yachman, an internal physician in Tel Aviv who provided medical services to the U.S. Embassy in Israel. He and his wife Sarah were returning home from a concert when they noticed a strange man standing on their doorstep. As they approached the man opened fire with a single shot from an Uzi, which hit Dr. Shmuel in the neck, killing him. The third and final victim is Deborah Chalks. She lived with her family in a small house near an orchard, a peaceful life. In the early morning hours of July 17, 1963, a man entered their home and fired several shots from an Uzi at her and her husband as they slept. She was killed and her husband was seriously injured. It was speculated that the murders may have been linked to Soviet involvement due to the third victim's previous visit to the Soviet Union and the second victim's service to the US Embassy. This theory falls short, however, because there's no explanation as to why the Soviets would have wanted to kill the first victim. In October of 2012, Deborah Chalks' son was interviewed by an Israeli newspaper. He claimed that his father had been active in organizing the escape of Soviet Jews who wanted to leave the country. He also said that his father continued working for Israeli intelligence after his arrival in Israel. He speculated that his mother had been followed after her visit to the Soviet Union and claimed that his father was the killer's actual target. I'm not sure if I just noticed it because I live in the Rocky Mountains or because we're here a lot, but we're back in Denver, Colorado with the Denver Strangler. There are 3 confirmed killings by them and 2 suspected killings. The first victim was Lena Tapper, a French prostitute who previously lived in Minnesota and later moved to Denver as the mistress of a Frenchman named Richard. They were both part of a secret French cult called this. Sorry, France, I don't know how to pronounce that. In which she played the role of a sex servant. On September 3rd, 1894, she was found strangled to death in her bed. The second victim was Marie Constant, who also was a French prostitute with ties to this weird secret order and lived with her lover, a man named Tony. On the day of her murder, Tony had fallen asleep while reading a newspaper, and on the following day, Marie was found dead in her bed, strangled to death. A small cord was so tightly drawn that it buried into her flesh with finger marks around her neck. She was a wealthier woman and only had 75 cents left on her at the time of death, leading authorities to believe that robbery was the motive for the killing. 5 men were arrested for this murder, including the first victim's love, Richard, who had made advances towards her. The third confirmed victim is a 24-year-old Japanese immigrant named Kiku Oyama. She was also a prostitute, and a few days prior to her murder, police had raided a local prostitution business and arrested several of her associates. She, along with the help of a French saloon keeper, secured their release, but the saloon keeper later demanded a monetary sum as a reward for his efforts. This made Marie angry and she argued with him about it. On the evening of November 13th, she was with her friends, but then returned home and was assumed to have fallen asleep. When her husband came home from a walk, he found her lying on the bed with a towel around her neck. She was still alive and gasping for air, so he took the towel off and ran across the street for help. Officer Carberry entered the room with him when he got there, however she had already died. There was evidence that a struggle had taken place in the room, as the bedsheets were disturbed and covered with blood. A secondary towel was on the washstand, and the killer had been through the room's drawers, most likely looking for money and valuables. There were many suspects in this case, however, none were ever confirmed or convicted. In my opinion, this person's for sure French. I mean, look at all the French connections in this case. The Kotaki Hona murders refers to a series of 18 mysterious murders of women, including 3 double murders starting in 2008, with the last murder being reported in 2015. These happened in Sri Lanka, and an arrest was made on December 11th, 2015, but his DNA only matched 6 of the victims. While the youngest victim was 19 and the oldest was 85, 15 of the 18 were over 60 years old. All the victims were women. They all took place around the same area. Many of them were before they were killed. Many of them were killed and then them and their houses were burnt down. and many of the killings showed clear evidence that they had been carried out by more than one culprit. Police then thought that not all the murders were connected, and it's possible that they were carried out by separate people. Disparus de Laser is the name of between 9 and 12 disappearances of children in the French division of Laser between 1983 and 1996. Some children were murdered, one was attacked but survived, and others have never been found. 3 of these cases have been solved, but the rest remain unsolved. In the spring of 2008, the French authorities created a unit called Mineurs 38, which translates to Minors 38, with 38 being the French departmental code for Laser. This unit consisted of several investigators tasked with re-examining all the cases. The Lewis-Clark Valley murders refers to a cluster of unsolved murders and disappearances that occurred in the Lewiston-Clarkston metro area of northern Idaho between 1979 and 1982. Authorities have identified 4 victims with a possible 5th connected to a single suspect. The first victim is Christina White, who was 12 and was last seen on April 28, 1979 at the county fair. She called her mom around 2:30 p.m. from a friend's house asking to pick her up, as she was feeling unwell from the heat. Now, I've had heat stroke, and it is just the worst. You're hot and sweaty, but then you also have the chills and you're nauseous. I personally hate being nauseous. Like, I know I would assume no one likes being nauseous, but it is like my least favorite. Like, if I could make a deal to break a leg or an arm once a year and never be nauseous again, I would take that in a heartbeat. Anyway, her mom was unable to pick her up as she didn't own a car and advised her just to rest, lay down, and apply a moist towel to her neck, then when she felt better to walk home. Her mom later assumed that she'd gotten better and returned to the fair because she didn't call her back. When her classmates last saw her, she was reportedly on her way home. Her schoolwork was discovered in pieces at a field outside of a city a few weeks after she vanished. She was last seen riding her bike, but neither her nor her bike have ever been found. The second victim is Kristen David, a senior at the University of Idaho. She was 22 at the time and was also last seen on her bike while traveling from Moscow, Idaho to Lewiston, Idaho. Her dismembered remains were found on July 4th, 6 miles west of Clarkston, Washington. The following day, some of the bones were discovered down the river. The body parts were wrapped in pages from several local newspaper editions from April of 1981, and the remains were hidden inside black plastic bags. Her clothes, personal belongings, and her bike have never been found. Christina Nelson and Jacqueline Miller are victims 3 and 4. They disappeared while walking from Christina's apartment to a grocery store in Lewiston, Idaho on September 12, 1982. On the same night, a possible 5th victim, Steve Persall, also went missing from the Lewiston Civic Theater. He was a custodian at the theater and asked his friend to drop him off there so he could do some laundry and practice his clarinet. He has not been seen or heard from since. He had a big brother type relationship with the 2 missing girls. The girls would have had to have passed the theater on their way to the store, so it's possible that they stopped in to say hi to Steven. The remains of Christina and Jacqueline were found on March 19, 1984 in a rural area 35 miles from Lewiston. Investigators initially suspected Steven may have been involved in the 2 girls' abduction and murders, but later stated that all 3 had probably been in or near the theater at the time they vanished, and they were all likely victims of the same killer. Authorities believe that Steven saw the murders and was killed as a result. The Lisbon Ripper was an unidentified serial killer who killed 3 prostitutes in Lisbon, Portugal between 1992 and 1993. The first victim was 22-year-old Maria Valentina. She was found on July 31st, 1992 in a large cabin, laying in a pool of her own blood. She had been strangled, disemboweled, and some of her internal organs had been removed. The second victim was 24-year-old Maria Fernanda. She was found January 27th, 1993, also in a cabin, and she was also disemboweled and had internal organs removed. The third and final victim was 27-year-old Maria Joao. She was found on March 15th, 1993, near the location of the first victim of whom she was a friend. Like the previous victims, she had been disemboweled, but this time all of her organs were removed. The police made a profile on the Ripper, saying he was probably a solitary man, unrelated to his victims, and most likely a person that they wouldn't expect. They also said his crimes could be considered perfect, as there were no clues to any potential culprit. The Hamburg Rubble Murderer is the name of an unidentified German serial killer allegedly responsible for the murders in Hamburg during early 1947. In total, 4 victims were found. On January 20th, 1947, in a deserted factory lot, the body of a young woman between the ages of 18 and 20 were found by children who were playing. A millimeter-wide mark on her neck indicated that she had been strangled with a string. On January 25th, 1947, the body of a nude man between the ages of 65 and 70 was found by scrap collectors. On February 1st, 1947, in the elevator shaft of a bombed-out house of a former mattress factory, the strangled body of a 6-year-old naked girl was found. On February 12th, 1947, the final victim's body was located, a woman between 30 and 35, naked, and also strangled to death. The identities of the victims were never discovered. All victims were robbed, stripped nude, and strangled. There were never any signs of a struggle for any of these deaths. The Toronto hospital baby deaths were a series of suspicious deaths that occurred in the cardiac ward of the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, Canada, between July 1980 and March 1981. There was a several-fold increase in mortality noticed on June 30th, 1980. Within 2 months, 20 patient deaths led to a group of nurses approaching the unit's cardiologists, but they kept the investigation limited and in-house to prevent a morale problem. The excess deaths continued, but it was not until March 1981 that a very upset father's extreme distress led to the coroner being brought in and detecting suspiciously high levels of a medication called digoxin. It's a heart regulation medication within his dead baby. The coroner, Dr. Paul Tepperman, said that he was first called to the hospital on March 12, 1981, because Kevin Garnett, a father, was unusually upset over the death of his 3-week-old son. I don't think there's any upset that is unusually upset if your child dies. It was only on March 20th, 1981, 8 days later, that he was told about an autopsy in January on a baby who also had high levels of digoxin. 8 days after that, he was told that an autopsy by the hospital had found 13 times the normal concentration of digoxin in another deceased baby. The medication had not been subject to any security measures at the time. Police were called in and began to search staff lockers when another baby died from digoxin poisoning on March 22, 1981. In January of 1982, babies became ill in a separate department. It was later found that non-fatal, unauthorized digoxin was administered on other babies, and another death was caused by an unauthorized dose of this medication. Back to September of 1981, the team leader nurse found propanolol tablets in her food that she was eating, and another nurse found propanolol tablets in her soup, leading to further investigation about nurse poisoning. The Atlanta Lovers Lane murders were a series of unsolved shooting attacks on 3 different couples in Atlanta, Georgia during early 1977. One attack caused 2 fatalities, one resulted in 1 fatality, and the other caused injuries, but no fatality. The same gun, a .38 caliber pistol, was used in all 3 shootings, which suggested that a single perpetrator was responsible for all 3 attacks. Around 1 a.m. on January 16, 1977, an out-of-control car drove full speed into an intersection and hit a street sign in Atlanta. Police were called after witnesses noticed the car occupants weren't coming out. They searched inside and found LeBrian Lovett and Veronica Hill, both nude with gunshot wounds. Both were still alive when found, and they were rushed to the hospital, where both unfortunately ended up succumbing to their wounds. It was determined that the couple had been engaged in sexual intercourse at the park when an unknown individual walked up and opened fire through the front window screen of the car. LeBrian tried to drive for help, but his injuries overtook him and caused him to lose control of the car. The second attack happened around 2 a.m. on February 12, 1977. Dennis Langston and Dietra Tatum were engaged in intercourse in a parked car when an unknown individual approached the passenger window and fired 6 shots. One of the bullets hit Dennis and another one hit Dietra. Both were still alive but seriously injured and rushed to the hospital. They both made a full recovery. They said that they did get a quick look at the shooter, but they were only able to identify him as a tall black male. On March 12th, 1977, Diana Collins and her fiancé were at a local park. They had seen a movie earlier that evening and were in the park to close out the date. The couple did not see the gunman as he drew near their vehicle. He shot 6 shots into the passenger side window, killing Diana. Her fiancé was wounded in the head, but survived. After the attack, he managed to drive the car to his house, where he called for an ambulance. The chain murders of Iran were a series of murders and disappearances of certain Iranian dissidents who had been critical of the Islamic Republic system, happening between 1988 and 1998. This actually isn't unsolved. It was done by the Iranian state, so I'm not sure why it's on this list. It is kind of an interesting thing, but because it's not unsolved, maybe we'll save it for a later video, because why is it on the Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg if it's not unsolved? Occurring in Singapore on January 6, 1979, the Geylang Bahru family murders is the murder of 4 children of the same family, the Tan family. At 6:35 a.m., Tan Chai and Li Ying, the children's parents, left for work. They worked for a bus company that would transport children to school. The couple's children, ages 5 through 10 at the time, were all still asleep. Around 7:10 a.m., Li Ying called home to wake up her children for school. However, there was no answer. She called a total of 3 times. She then called the neighbor to see if she could go knock on the door to wake up the children. The neighbor knocked on the door, but also received no answer. The couple returned home shortly after 10 a.m., and Li Ying found the bodies of her children in the bathroom. The children had been stacked on top of each other, wearing only t-shirts and underwear, and had knife wounds on their heads. The right arm of the oldest child had been almost completely cut off, and the youngest child had slash wounds on her face. The report said that the children had 20 slash wounds each. The police concluded that the murders were premeditated, and that the killer, or killers even, had made sure not to leave any evidence. There were bloodstains in the kitchen sink, and the killer appeared to have cleaned themselves prior to leaving the house. There was no evidence of forced entry, the house hadn't been destroyed or ransacked, and no items were reported missing. The murder weapon is believed to either be a dagger, like a knife, or a cleaver. The murder weapon's also never been found. The oldest boy, the one whose arm was almost cut off, appeared to have put up a fight, as there were several strands of long hair found in his right hand. While no motive has ever been identified, the police thought the murder was purely vengeance motivated. The police also believed that the killer was either close with the family or had intimate family knowledge of their circumstances. Li Ying had a surgery to have her tubes tied so that she could no longer have children after her 4th child. And 2 weeks after the murder, the couple received a Chinese New Year card depicting happy children playing, and inside was written, "Now you can have no more offspring, ha ha ha," in Chinese. The card was signed, the murderer. So, as the name would suggest, the February 2007 Salvadoran congressman killings were the murders of 3 Salvadoran congressmen and their driver occurring on February 19th, 2007. This is actually just the start of many killings revolving around this case. The 3 congressmen were on their way to Guatemala City to attend the Central American Parliament. Their Land Cruiser, part of a 4-car motorcade, headed to the capital, pulled out of the convoy and onto a remote road about 20 miles southeast of Guatemala City. So this kind of to me is very suspicious. Why did no one else in the convoy go, "Hey, where are they going?" and follow them? The car's in a convoy of 4 cars, and none of the other 3 cars went, "Hey, wait a minute." The bodies were found the next day in the vehicle, and the vehicle was charred and burnt. There were also indications that they had been tortured before their death. Soon after the murders, 4 Guatemalan police officers were arrested. They had been tracked by a GPS system embedded into the police car that was on the scene of the killings. All were formally charged in connection to the murders, and they were secretly moved to a maximum security prison. A few days later, on February 25th, all 4 men were murdered within their prison cell. The killings were followed by a prison riot, with the warden and some guards being taken hostage. Initial reports suggested that the gunman entered the prison disguised as a visitor. The state police, however, stated that it was more likely that the gunman came from inside the prison, since it would have been almost impossible for them to have gotten past all 3 layers of security perimeters, including the prison guards, the national police, and the army. 20 men at the prison were arrested, including the warden and many guards. In early of March 2007, a top police official resigned his position and fled the country with his family, seeking first asylum in Costa Rica and then in Venezuela. He was involved in arresting the 4 officers and claimed to be in fear for his life. He and his family then fled to Austria and were granted asylum. In late March of 2007, both the chief of the National Police and the Interior Minister resigned. On April 8, 2008, Victor Rivera was shot and killed while driving in Guatemala City just 2 days after he was fired from his position with the Ministry of the Interior, where he was investigating the deaths of the 4 deputies. The person investigating his murder was immediately accused of conducting a cover-up and arrested. No other movement on this case has happened. The Seawin murder case is one of the biggest Swiss crime cases and is the biggest Swiss murder case. The killings took place during the holiday of Pentecost, a Christian holiday that I wasn't aware of, that takes place 50 days after Easter in 1976. The holiday happens every year, not just in 1976. This case happened in 1976. 5 people were killed with a Winchester rifle, with a total of 13 bullets being fired. 11 of the 13 bullets hit the heads of the victims and the other 2 hit the chest. The 5 victims were Elsa, age 62, her husband Eugene, age 63, Eugene's sister Anna, aged 80, Anna's son Emmanuel, age 52, and Anna's other son Max, age 49. The bodies were found by a woman who was out on a walk. When the police arrived, they found 4 corpses in their rented house, with the 5th being wrapped in a carpet on the balcony. The police suspected that only Elsa and Eugene were supposed to be killed, but then the killer was surprised when they entered the house and there were 3 other people there that he now had to kill too. There are 2 main suspects in this case, the first being a person named Carl Dozer. The gun that was identified as the weapon used to kill the victims was found hidden in the walls of his kitchen. He had bought the gun in 1973, and earlier when he'd been interviewed by the police, he lied and said that he had sold the gun. He was never charged because a clear motive for the killings couldn't be found, and he didn't even know the victims. While no charges were filed, the majority of the Swiss population believes that he is the killer. The second suspect is a man named Adolf Siegrist, a man who is actually related to the victims. He was put on the list by his co-worker Hans Blazer. Hans felt that Adolf was the culprit and Carl Dozer helped him. Adolf had been seen purchasing ammo 3 weeks before the crime and asked for ammunition with extra heavy lead bullets and asked if the rounds would fit in his Italian Winchester rifles. He also mentioned that he was purchasing the ammo for someone else. There were also styrofoam heads in his apartment that had been shot through. The motive for him would remain unknown as well, but it's thought that he was mad at the couple for giving him the nickname Dolfelli, which is a belittling name for Adolf. Also, I don't know the Swiss accent, that's why I gave it an Italian accent. It sounded very Dolfelli. It sounded Dolfeli. Sounds very Italian. He was arrested temporarily, but died in the mid-1980s. On October 8th, 2014, a co-worker of Jin Chen found the bodies of Jin, his wife, and their 2 children in their home in New York. Police were called to the scene and determined that the family had been killed sometime in the hours before dawn that day with either a knife or a hammer. I'm not sure how you can look at a body and say, oh, this was either killed with a knife or a hammer. I feel like those would leave 2 very different wounds. I haven't seen the bodies, so I can't entirely say, but I feel like they would leave 2 very different wounds. When Jin had not arrived for work at the King's Walk restaurant and also hadn't called to say that he wasn't coming in or that he would be late, one of his coworkers went to his house a half-mile from the restaurant. His coworker rushed back to the restaurant after finding the body and asked another coworker to call 911 since his English was extremely limited. The police responded and began to seal off the crime scene and were assisted by the New York State Police and their detectives. Police were slow to release information, and much of what was reported in the early days of the case came from the family relatives. Jin's brother told reporters that his brother's body had been found on the first floor of his small bungalow house, while the other members of the family were found upstairs, covered by a blanket. He denied an early report that they had been shot, and later details emerged that the victims had been beaten with a hammer, and later accounts also mentioned that they were stabbed. I guess that's where it comes from. I don't know why earlier in some of the articles I read, it's yeah, it was either a hammer or a knife, and here it's mentioning both. The crime came as a shock to the small suburb, which was normally quiet. The town's chief of police said that she had never seen anything like it. She said that she had not only grown up in the town, but in the neighborhood where the Chens lived, which made it more personal to her. As people know, the first 48 hours of an investigation is the most crucial period. There's a whole TV show called 48 about this. Local law enforcement said that the investigation was slow during this time, however, as, quote, there were so many cultural impediments, language barriers, and an overwhelming sense of fear among the members of the local Chinese immigrant community that detectives attempted to talk to. No home or business nearby had security cameras that would have provided any footage to review. From the beginning, there were allegations that the Chens had been involved in illegal business activities such as human trafficking, money laundering, or illegal gambling. However, none of this has been confirmed. Okay, so despite the name, this actually has nothing to do with the city of San Francisco in the state of California, but a train called the City of San Francisco, which was a cross-country passenger train running from Oakland, California to Chicago, Illinois, and back. At the time, the train was traveling west from Chicago to Oakland, but it was behind schedule by about a half hour. After leaving Carlin, Nevada, the engineer increased the speed to 90 miles per hour to make up some time. At 9:33 p.m., the train hit a patch of rail that had been deliberately moved out of alignment and then camouflaged with a brown paint and tumbleweeds, derailing the train while it crossed the number 4 bridge into the Humble River Gorge. The engineer of the train survived and ran to the closest telephone to contact emergency services. Volunteers from both the cities of Poway and Carlin rushed to the scene with medical supplies, but survivors were not taken to the hospital until a rescue train was assembled and took them to Elko, Nevada the next morning. A total of 5 cars on the train were destroyed: a 32-seat coffee shop kitchen car, a 72-seat diner, a buffet lounge car, and 2 sleeper cars. 24 people total were killed and 121 were seriously injured. In the following days, divers discovered tools in the Humboldt River, showing they had been an act of sabotage. Investigators estimated that it would take a strong person about an hour to move the tracks, and they noted that the previous train passed through the area 4 hours before. Southern Pacific, who owned and operated the railway, put out a $5,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of the perpetrators, and it was eventually increased to $10,000. A number of lone hobos were arrested, but investigators argued that it was more than likely carried out by 2 or more people, and they would have to have extensive knowledge of railroad operations. The arrests and interrogations led nowhere. To this day, this wreck remains the deadliest train disaster in Nevada history. The 1894 Rock Island Railroad wreck occurred when a train pulling 2 passenger cars derailed on August 19, 1894 in Lincoln, Nebraska, killing 11 people. The train, which had departed on a nearly 2-hour journey at around 7:30 p.m., derailed just minutes away from its destination at 9:20 p.m. The train reached a 400-foot bridge that carried trains 40 feet above the waters of the Salt Creek. The bridge began to bend as the engine crossed onto it, and as the passenger cars began to cross, the weight became too much, and the train crashed into the creek below. When it hit the bottom, the engine exploded, spilling hot coals on both the train and the wooden bridge, and soon flames engulfed both. 3 men were able to escape the crash quickly and organized an effort to rescue other passengers. The 3 determined that the passengers in the first car and the engine were beyond help and focused on the rear car, from where they were able to rescue 15 passengers. The first building that could be seen from here was the state penitentiary 2 miles away, from which they called the fire and police departments as well as the railroad. A train reached the scene about 40 minutes after the crash to carry the survivors on to Lincoln. Due to the equipment and conditions at the time, no fire wagons could reach the site, and it was reported that the only thing that they could do was just let the whole pile burn out. Of the 33 passengers on board, 11 were killed in the crash. Survivors of the crash began to tell police that, following the crash, they had seen an unknown man holding a lantern near the bridge. This, along with some evidence found at the scene, suggested that the crash was not simply an accident, but sabotage. The police arrested a man who was believed to be the man with the lantern, George Washington Davis. However, there was almost no evidence to suggest that he was the perpetrator. He never admitted any involvement, and investigators couldn't offer an explanation of motive. Despite all of this, he was tried twice for sabotage. During the first trial, first-degree murder couldn't be proven, and the jury couldn't reach a verdict. During the second trial, the jury was informed by the judge that if the prosecutors failed to prove his guilt of first-degree murder, the jury could convict the defendant of second-degree murder. In 1895, he was convicted of second-degree murder. 10 years later, the governor paroled Davis, citing lack of evidence or motive and grave doubts as to his involvement. This is both one of the largest instances of mass murder and the largest officially unsolved crime in not only Lincoln, Nebraska, but Nebraska as a whole. On December 29, 1975, a bomb detonated near the TWA baggage claim terminal in LaGuardia Airport in New York City. The blast killed 11 people and 74 more were seriously injured. Investigators believe the explosion was the equivalent of 25 sticks of dynamite, and it had been placed in a coin-operated locker located next to the baggage carousel. The bomb blew the lockers apart, sending fragmentations of the lockers flying across the room. The force of the bomb ripped a 10-foot by 15-foot hole in the 8-inch reinforced concrete ceiling of the area. The resulting fire in the terminal took over an hour to get under control. The death toll actually could have been much worse, but most of the passengers had already left the baggage claim, and the main victims were unfortunately airport employees. Following the explosion, airports throughout the country were evacuated after receiving hoax bomb threats. There were many groups that were thought to have been linked to the attack, including the Palestine Liberation Organization, the Mafia, the FALN, and the Jewish Defense League. However, there was nothing to tie any of these organizations to the bombing other than a past history of violence. The Butcher of Mons is an unidentified serial killer who committed 5 murders between January of 1996 and July of 1997 in or near the Belgian city of Mons. On March 22, 1997, a police officer discovered 9 garbage bags containing human remains. They were examined by a magistrate who determined that the arms and legs in the bags were from 3 different bodies, all of whom were women. On March 24th, a 10th bag was discovered, containing the chest of a woman. On April 12th, 2 bags were found that contained a foot, a leg, and a head. The victims were 43-year-old Carmelina Russo, 43-year-old Martine Bon, 33-year-old Jacqueline Lacklerk, 21-year-old Natalie Goddard, and 37-year-old Bigona Valencia. A special investigation unit was created to solve the murders. However, the unit reported that they had lack of staffing from the case because it was considered a local case, and since 2007, the units only consisted of 4 investigators. During this investigation, several people were suspected of being involved in the murders, but no concrete evidence was ever found against any of them. The Uni Phantom, which is short for the University Phantom of Bochum, is a German serial sex offender who is said to have committed up to 21 assaults. The Phantom's first victim, again, the Phantom, what a cool name, stop doing that, was a 12-year-old schoolgirl, especially with people that assault 12-year-old schoolgirls, stop giving them cool names. The Phantom. She was raped on January 7th, 1994, on her way home from school in a wooded area. In September of 1994, the perpetrator struck for a second time, sexually abusing a 44-year-old. He continued with assaults around the area until June of 1996, when he attacked his first victim in Bochum. From then on, he preyed mostly on young women in the vicinity of Ruhr University Bochum, continuing until 2002. In 2003, another victim came forward, with her assault occurring in August of 2001. All of the rapes were determined to be committed by the same perpetrator after DNA analysis. Early sketches of the Phantom showed the culprit as a middle-aged man, slim, with a mustache. He was said to have committed all of his crimes while wearing a disguise, dressed in all black, and wearing a hat. The police assumed that the offender likely had good local knowledge of the areas. It's assumed that he lives or lived there and could possibly have family ties there. All of the crime scenes were near public transport stops where he may have met his victims. After the last known assault occurring in December 1st of 2002, he has not struck again, leaving many questions unanswered. The Batman Rapist is an English serial sex offender who committed at least 17 sexual assaults on women in the city of Bath between 1991 and 2000. He holds the record for Britain's longest-running serial rape investigation, which is codenamed Operation Eagle and has eluded capture for more than 30 years. This has nothing to do with the crime, but I just got put on a team at work called the Eagle Team, so that made me think about work. He got the nickname of Batman Rapist after leaving a baseball cap having the Batman logo at the scene of his crime. His crimes were usually committed during the darker winter months, and he attacked women of all ages. In May of 2000, he attempted to carjack a 26-year-old woman in Bath while her 7-year-old daughter was in the car. He targeted lone women who had just returned to their cars, abducting them at knife point before forcing them to drive to a secluded area in the south of the city where he assaulted them. After assaulting his victims, he often forced them to drive back to where he abducted them to drop him off. His victims described him as wearing all black and having a hat on. There are actually a lot of parallels here between him and the Uniphantom, in my opinion, and if the UK was attached to the rest of Europe, I would think that they're probably the same person. With that being said, they also did describe him as slim, which they described the Uniphantom as, but they did describe him as clean shaven, while the Uniphantom had a mustache. They also said he was about 5'9" with blue eyes and had a scar on his bottom lip. On December 19th, 1959, Christine and Cliff Walker and their 2 children were murdered at their home in Osprey, Florida. Authorities believe that Christine arrived at the family farmhouse around 4 p.m. on Saturday, December 19th, where she was raped and then murdered by gunshot. Her husband Cliff then arrived with their 3-year-old son and 1-year-old daughter. Cliff was ambushed and killed by gunshot as well. His son Jimmy and daughter Debbie were then murdered. Jimmy was shot, and Debbie was shot and drowned, and the actual cause of her death is unknown. Physical evidence left at the scene included a bloody cowboy boot, a cellophane strip from a cigarette wrapper, and a fingerprint on the bathtub faucet handle. A serial killer named Emmett Monroe Spencer confessed to the murders, but the confession was discredited by Sarasota County Sheriff Ross Boyer, who labeled Spencer a pathological liar. His confession was determined to be cleverly constructed from real murders written up in newspapers and true crime novels that he liked to read. In 1994, a bartender in Pennsylvania actually contacted the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office, claiming that one of her customers had been boasting about killing the Walker family, but this tip was never verified. Police never identified a motive, and 587 people were suspects at one time or another, and the case remains open to this day. In 2012, there were actually some possible connections between this case and 2 killers named Perry Smith and Richard Hickok. Once all of the leads that had existed between them had been explored and a possible connection had been found, DNA evidence that they were able to gather did not match either of the men. Richard and Belinda Cowden, along with their 2 children, disappeared from their campgrounds in the Siskiyou Mountains near Copper, Oregon on September 1st, 1974. 7 months later, in April of 1975, their bodies were discovered approximately 7 miles from the campsite. Law enforcement actually suspected Dwayne Lee Little of the murders. He had been paroled from the Oregon State Penitentiary on May 24th of 1974, just 3 months before the disappearance of the Cowdens. In 1964, he had raped and murdered a teenager. State police were able to determine that Dwayne had been in Copper, Oregon over the Labor Day weekend at the approximate time that the Cowden family disappeared. His girlfriend told law enforcement that she had seen him with a .22 caliber gun during Christmas of 1974, and on January 12, 1975, his parole was revoked after she informed the police of his possession of the firearm. He was paroled again on April 26 of 1977. On June 2nd of 1980, he picked up a pregnant 23-year-old named Maggie Hunter, whose car had broken down near Portland, Oregon, and assaulted and beat her. Maggie and her unborn child luckily survived, and Dwayne was charged and convicted of attempted homicide and sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences. Police later suspected that 2 men and a woman in a truck that had been reported by a Los Angeles family at the campground at the time the Cowdens disappeared were in fact Dwayne and his parents. Dwayne was 25 at the time of the Cowdens' disappearance. Dwayne and his parents denied any knowledge of the Cowdens' disappearances. However, a miner who owned a cabin nearby claimed that he and his parents had stopped by on Monday, September 2nd, 1974, and signed the guest book. An inmate who shared a cell with Dwayne claimed that he confessed to the Cowdens' murders. Despite the amount of circumstantial evidence, he has never been charged with the murders. Kind of like I mentioned last Monday, it should be hard to convict someone purely on circumstantial evidence. Okay, so the 20th century limited derailment, from what I found, is just a train derailment that happened because the engineer was pushing the train too hard and it was going too fast and they took a turn and it just happened. So I don't know where the mystery is, so we're just going to move on. The 1978 Holiday Inn fire broke out at a Holiday Inn hotel located in the town of Greece, New York. 10 people were killed and 34 had been injured. Initially, the police department did not consider the fire suspicious. Questions arose about whether or not the fire's alarms could be heard from the lobby of the hotel when the firefighters arrived. Hotel officials said that the alarms were functioning, however firefighters first at the scene said that they couldn't hear them. The New York fire investigator brought in to assist with the investigation discovered that an uncommon, highly flammable liquid accelerant was used to start the fire inside a storage cupboard under the first floor stairwell. The fire was officially ruled as an arson attack, but no one has ever been charged with this crime and the case remains open today. In 2011, police launched the most intensive investigation of the fire in the previous 30 years. In 2014, police announced that they had identified a suspect for the first time 36 years after the fire. However, nothing else has transpired since. Okay, so this one's pretty short. The 1924 Canadian Pacific Railway train bombing. Essentially, a man by the name of Peter Varagin was a Russian philosopher and leader of the Doukhobors in Canada, and he was assassinated aboard a train on the Canadian Pacific Railway. The explosion killed him and 6 others, and to this date, there have been no suspects, but many of his followers actually believe that the Canadian government is involved. Canadian Pacific Airlines Flight 21 was a scheduled domestic flight from Vancouver to Whitehorse, Canada on July 8, 1965. The plane crashed near 100 Mile House with all 52 people on board dying. A coroner's report concluded that an explosive substance foreign to the normal contents of the aircraft is what caused the crash. A witness on the ground saw the tail of the aircraft separate from the fuselage and debris trail out from behind the aircraft. Sadly, the debris that he was seeing turned out to be the bodies of passengers forced out by the depressurization of the aircraft. The investigators found traces of acid that led them to believe that a bomb was in the bathroom. Traces of chemicals consistent with a low-velocity explosion were found as well. No one claimed responsibility and no charges were ever filed. The source of the explosion remains unknown, and this is exactly what I want to research a week before I take a flight. The B1 Butcher is an unidentified serial killer in Namibia. They murdered at least 5 women between 2005 and 2007, with all murders happening near the National Road B1, which is kind of where they get their name. The Butcher got its name from the Namibian media due to the victim's remains being found in close proximity to the National Road B1, which crosses the country from north to south. The Butcher part of the name stems from the professional way in which the bodies were dismembered. The Butcher was also referred to as the Comus Ripper due to the region where the remains of the victims were found. All 5 of the victims were young or middle-aged women. 2 of the 5 could not be identified. The other 3 were Juanita Mabula, 21, Melanie Jantz, 22, and Sana Helena, 36. All the victims' body parts showed signs of freezing or refrigeration, suggesting that they were in some sort of cold storage, at least for a bit. The way each of them were murdered is not consistent, however, as some were strangled, while others were hit on the head with blunt objects. At least 2 of the 5 victims were also prostitutes in the area. The Rainbow Maniac is the name of a person responsible for the Patriots Park murders, which were a series of 13 murders of gay men committed between July 2007 and August of 2008. The murders took place in Patriots Park in Brazil. The victims were all gay men aged 20 to 40. All except for one victim was shot in the head. The other one died from blows to the head. The last victim was actually shot 12 times. According to Brazilian media, the park is in an area frequented by prostitutes. The first murder occurred on July 4th, 2007, and the last happened on March 15th, 2009. Officials from the Sao Paulo State Public Safety Department announced that the killer could be a state police officer. As of 2008, tests are underway to see if the same gun was used in each murder. On December 10th, 2008, police arrested a retired state police sergeant, Juan Francisco Franco, based on statements implicating him in the murder which occurred on August 19, 2008. A witness claims to have seen that Franco shot a black gay man 12 times that night. Another witness told police that Franco often visited the park to look for gay men and victims. On August 23, 2011, however, he was released after a trial and he was found not guilty. The Lodz gay murderer is an unidentified Polish serial killer who operated in Lodz from 1988 to 1993. He murdered 7 men, all of whom were gay. Lots of hate crimes in this episode, I guess. All victims were killed in their own houses and right after or even during sexual intercourse. The perpetrator would then steal TVs, videos, jewelry, cash, and any other items from the apartment of the murdered men. The victims were killed in all sorts of manners, including strangling, stabbing, or being beaten to death. The murders didn't seem to be planned ahead of time because all the tools that were used to commit the crimes were objects from the victims' houses. The last man who was killed was a man by the name of Kazimierz K, who was 62 years old. After he was killed, an important witness came forward, a man who claimed to have relations with a young man named Roman. The witness said that he met with Roman the previous day, where they went to Kazimierz K's apartment for a party. When all the guests left, it was just Kazimierz and Roman who stayed behind. The following day, he was found dead. The witness testified that Roman told him a lot about himself. Roman said that he was raped by an educator from the reformatory when he was 15. He was supposedly working in the Eskimo cotton industry and lived with his mother in the area of Rizgowska Street. He was 27, had hazel eyes and dark blonde hair combed to the side. He also had tattoos, a dot over his left eye, and a dot and letters on the fingers of his left hand. However, this Roman person has never been found. On March 21st, 2021, a mass grave containing the mutilated corpses of 4 teenage boys was found by a shepherd's dog in the Jankanil area of Pakistan. As the locals dug up the bodies, one was found to have been beheaded, one had been shot, and the other 2 had been stoned to death. The victims were identified. They were between 13 and 17 years old and were known to hunt birds and wild rabbits in the area. The boys had gone hunting 3 weeks earlier and were never seen alive again. Soon after the bodies were discovered, a protest sit-in was started with the dead bodies to demand action against militants. The local police placed roadblocks and used tear gas and guns to stop the protesters. The reason for these protests is because, according to local journalists, the 4 boys had also been kidnapped during 2020 by a militant group when they went out hunting as well. There was a video released of them being held hostage and then they were freed. It's still unknown who caused the death of these boys. The Pharmacy Maniac is the name of a Russian serial killer who killed 2 men in 2011, both of them in pharmacies. The first murder was on May 26, 2011. The killer entered the pharmacy wearing a medical mask like the COVID ones, glasses, and a hat. He also had a sawed-off shotgun and a black cellophane bag. When he entered the pharmacy, there were a total of 8 people in the store, 4 employees and 4 customers. He proceeded to demand cash and jewelry from the people, stating, "I need 60,000 rubles. Put the money in. Whoever doesn't want to can move away, but I will shoot them in the stomach." Later, 2 more women entered the pharmacy and the robber ordered them to give him their jewelry and to get on the ground. The women gave him some gold chains, a bracelet, a ring, a cross, and a church pendant. While this was happening, some people were able to escape from the emergency exit. Then, Vladimir Shin, a 49-year-old man, entered the pharmacy to purchase his medications. Seeing the robbery in progress, he attempted to run out of the front door. The robber yelled "stop" and then shot Shin in the chest, killing him. The robber then fled the scene. Later that same year, on August 10th, 2011, the same robber entered another pharmacy only 500 meters, a little under half a mile, away from the first location. He wasted no time, shooting Igor Unistov, a 30-year-old man, upon first entering the store. Without even stealing anything, he went outside and reloaded his gun. After reloading, he walked back inside and shot Igor in the head multiple times. By this point, multiple people were able to escape through another room. There were, however, some witnesses left who said that the robber said, "It's your fault," put his gun in the cellophane bag, and then left. The Monster of the Manjones is the name of a Colombian serial killer who murdered between 30 and 38 teenage boys in the 1960s and 70s in the city of Santiago de Cali. He is believed to be a local and native to the city, and most of his victims were killed in remote vacant lots. At the time, it was the most notorious criminal case in the country's history. For some, the monster became a myth or legend, while others still believed he existed because of course he does. His methods were sadistic to say the least. He would often insert needles into the heart and then the thorax, then he would assault rape and torture his victims. He would then use the needles to draw blood from his victims, killing them. He was described as a true sexual sadist, and maybe even suffered from clinical vampirism. El Psicopata, translating to the psychopath, is the alias given to a Costa Rican serial killer responsible for the murders of 19 people from 1986 to 1996. Again, that's kind of a cool name. Like, if you're going for serial killer names, the psychopath, kind of cool. He was named by the civil police of Costa Rica in 1996, who are investigating similar crimes that were unsolved from the previous years. According to Costa Rica legislation, however, the crime statute of limitations has expired, and if the suspect or suspects were found, they could no longer be charged for any of the murders. I don't understand why murder has a statute of limitations. Like, you're telling me I could go kill someone and then 20 years later it's like, hey, I did that, by the way, and they can't do anything about it. I don't think they have a statute of limitation on murder in the United States, but that's crazy, Costa Rica. This one also kind of feels like they just can't solve a number of murders, and so they're just like, it's a serial killer. Happening in 2012 in Kharkiv, Ukraine, the Kharkiv beheadings was a mass murder in which a judge and his family were beheaded with a machete. The judge, Vladimir Trofimov, his wife Irina, their son Sergei, and the son's girlfriend were attacked in the eastern Ukraine city on December 15, 2012. They were attacked at his family home. The bodies were all left at the scene minus their heads. It was reported that the judge, his wife, and the girlfriend were killed and then beheaded, but the son was beheaded while still alive. Police say that the motive was unknown, but possibly could be revenge or theft. The Milwaukee Police Department bombing occurred on November 24, 1927 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, USA. The bomb killed 9 members of the police force as well as 1 civilian. The perpetrators were never caught, but it was suspected to be an anarchist terrorist cell operating within the United States in the early 20th century. The target was actually initially an evangelical church in the 3rd Ward and only killed the police officers when the bomb was taken from the church to the police department by a concerned citizen. The reason for thinking that it was done by a local anarchist group was actually due to the initial target. On September 9th, 1917, the Reverend of the 3rd Ward Evangelical Church held a rally in Milwaukee's Bayview neighborhood. Anarchists disrupted the rally, police fired on the demonstrators, killing 2, arresting 11, and that led to a raid on their organization. The Bigfoot Killer, shout out to last week's video, is the name given to an unidentified American serial killer who raped and murdered 7 women in Detroit between February and October of 1975. He chose young girls between 16 and 22 who prostituted themselves as his victims and raped 4 in early 1975. His victims went to the police and described his appearance. The picture displayed here is the composite sketch made by the police. Later in 1975, he killed a total of 7 women, 5 black and 2 white. During the investigation, witnesses reported that the killer had driven a beige Oldsmobile and was offering only $15 in exchange for sexual services. Then, he and his victim would go back to his car, after which he would threaten them with a knife, beat them, sodomize them, and then finally strangle them to death. He was described as a muscular, tall African American with facial hair and an afro, likely between the ages of 30 and 35. Police believe he suffered from something called acromegaly, which is excess growth of certain parts of the body, as according to testimonies and other evidence, he had large hands and feet. This is where he got the name Bigfoot. The Edgecombe County serial killer is a killer in the Edgecombe and Halifax counties in North Carolina, USA, between 2005 and 2009. There are 10 suspected victims, all African American women, with the remains of 8 being found. All the victims were black, engaged in prostitution, and had problems with drug addictions. The first victim was reported missing on May 30th, 2005. Following an autopsy, it was found that she had suffered from several knife wounds, as well as blows to the head from a blunt object, which was fatal. The most pivotal death in the case, however, was the death of Tahara Nicholson. She was reported missing February 22nd, 2009. She'd been strangled to death, but traces of body fluid were found on her body, which led the police to her killer, Antoine Pittman. Only 1 death was ever officially attributed to Antoine, but the police believe that he was responsible for all of them, as they stopped finding bodies in this killer's dumping grounds after his arrest. This is another case of it being unsolved only in an official capacity because everyone's pretty sure it was Antoine Pittman. Allegedly. The Paraquat murders were a series of indiscriminate beverage poisonings occurring in Japan in 1985. The drinks were placed in or near vending machines where the victims would drink the beverage. They were all poisoned with the herbicide paraquat except for one. According to the New York Times, the first victim was 52-year-old Haru Otso. On April 30th, 1985, in Fukuyama, he stopped by a vending machine on his way to go fishing and purchased 2 drinks called Oro Namen C. Halfway through the second bottle, he began to feel sick and was taken to the hospital where he died the next night. There were 35 more poisonings following his death, with 11 of them resulting in death. The drink, Oranamen C, had a buy one get one free special going on at the time, which the killer took advantage of by poisoning that drink specifically. The murders stopped after warnings were placed on vending machines by both vending machine operators and drink companies. The monster of Udine killed at least 4 victims in the Udine province in northeastern Italy between 1971 and 1989. The reason I say at least 4 victims is because while there are 4 confirmed killings, there could be anywhere between 4 and 16 deaths attributed to this killer. The 4 victims were found with gaping holes in their abdomens, which had been cut and cleaned with extreme care, most likely with a scalpel. The cuts were actually close to that of a C-section, which convinced the police that the killer was a doctor. However, the police have never had any leads in this case, and there is no other information on the case. Speaking of doctors, I'm not sure why the Ann Arbor Hospital murders is on here. 2 nurses were found guilty of poisoning and conspiracy to poison patients. They were found not guilty of murder, but they were found guilty of poisoning and conspiracy to poison. So, in my mind, case closed. This is not unsolved. The Flat Tire murders were a series of unsolved murders in Broward and Miami-Dade counties in Florida, USA, between 1975 and January 1976. The name originated from the investigators' belief that when the offender committed 2 of the murders, he had deflated the tires of his victims' cars. A list of suspected victims included 12 women whose bodies were discovered in or near South Florida canals. The suspected perpetrator was described as a white male between 20 and 25 years old, well-dressed, physically athletic and attractive, likely an above-average IQ, and a sexual sadist. Using his charm, he would gain the trust of his potential victims, which he would then lure to his car. In most cases, the victims were beaten and raped before they were killed, and then they were stripped and thrown into the canals, streams, or left near embankments. While the official number is 12, it believed that this killer could have committed 35-plus murders. The San Juan del Sur psychopath is the name of a Nicaraguan serial killer responsible for at least 1 death, which actually would not make him a serial killer, but it could be a total of 10. Between 2000 and 2002, a total of 10 men died in the coastal town of San Juan del Sur under suspicious circumstances, causing the locals to spread rumors of a serial killer in the area. Authorities were called in but could only confirm that 1 of the men was murdered, as the others didn't have any external injuries to their bodies and had likely passed away from other causes, such as alcohol intoxication or suffocation. Only 1 man was ever charged or even the suspect of any of these murders, a German man who illegally lived in the city on an expired visa. He was accused of being responsible for at least 7 of the deaths by the locals, and on March 22, 2002, he was arrested. The case was dismissed, however, due to lack of evidence, and there have been no suspects since. The Belize Ripper is a Belizean serial killer responsible for the abduction, rape, and murder of 5 girls in Belize City between 1998 and 2000. The FBI and Scotland Yard even helped the authorities investigate, but all of the kills remain unsolved. By the way, this is just personal preference. I think Scotland Yard is such a cool name. Scotland Yard is a way cooler name than the FBI. The killings caused widespread panic in the country, with a national curfew enforced and guards set up at every school. In the months following the last murder, several incidents were reported of a man driving a red car wearing a stocking mask who unsuccessfully attempted to attack and kidnap young girls within the city, but authorities were never able to find this person. Okay, so despite sounding like a Chainsaw Man character, Shotgun Man is an alleged assassin and spree killer in Chicago, Illinois in the 1910s. He killed 15 Italian immigrants from January 1st, 1910 to March 26, 1911. In March of 1911, he reportedly killed 4 people within 72 hours. It's believed that he worked for the Black Hand Gang, but since this was the 1910s, there's actually not a lot of info on it, and that's it. That's all the info there is on Shotgun Man. The Mad Pooper is the nickname given to an unidentified woman allegedly seen here in Colorado Springs, Colorado, USA. She repeatedly pooped in public while jogging during the summer months of 2017. She primarily targeted one family's property. However, she did not poop there exclusively, leaving some of her excrement at other places nearby. Photographs allegedly showing her were made public, but neither her nor anyone with any information came forward. Police were pretty sure that she was doing it on purpose, and she didn't just have to poop really bad, because there were several public toilets within a block of where she was taking her dumps. Procter & Gamble, the parent company for Charmin, offered a free year's supply of Charmin if she turned herself in. After a burst of media attention, police reported that there had been no further reports of a woman pooping in public. The Danilovsky Maniac is an unidentified Russian serial killer. It's suspected that he committed at least 7 murders between 2004 and 2007. 3 of the murders were committed in an abandoned construction site on Danilovsky Street, which is where the killer got his name. In 2008, a reward was offered of 500,000 rubles for anyone who would help catch the man. However, he has still never been found. The I-80 Rapist is a series of 3 rapes committed in Sacramento, California. Fun fact, I guess it's not really that fun, I-80 runs through Utah. While many people were convinced that other assaults took place by the same man, only 3 people have been linked to him by DNA. These happened on September 9th, 2013, December 10th, 2013, and January 8th, 2014. There is no description of this man or what he could look like at all. There is no information. The Sao Paulo Monster was a criminal who attacked young children in April of 1973 in Sao Paulo, Brazil. His method of attacking was to approach young children when their parents were looking away or were busy. He would say, "Hey, take my hand, I have something to show you." Oftentimes they would take his hand and walk away with him. He would take them to a nearby building and then rape them. He would then tell them to go back to their parents while he escaped. There were multiple people arrested, but none were ever convicted. Joro the Paver, also known as Bulgarian Jack the Ripper, is a serial rapist and murderer who operated in Sofia, Bulgaria in 1968. In the span of a few months, 6 or 7 rapes occurred, and as a result, a 69-year-old woman died in the hospital. There was a deaf and mute man who was accused of being the perpetrator and was arrested by the police. Although he was initially sentenced and spent a significant amount of time in jail, he was later released due to lack of evidence. The true identity of the man remains unknown, and it's theorized that he continues to rape and murder to this day. So interestingly enough, the I-65 killer was solved in 2022. Testing done by the police in 2022 returned a 99.999% probability of it being Harry Edward Greenwall, who had passed away in 2013 in prison. So we're going to call this bad boy solved. The Arellano Family Massacre is where 5 out of 6 family members who were traveling from Mexico to San Angelo to visit family were killed. They were killed on Highway 277 between Del Rio and Sonora, Texas. The description of the suspect is 6 feet tall, weighs about 200 pounds, between 30 and 35, with sandy hair, light eyebrows, and a rash on his neck. He wore a straw cowboy hat, had boots with an eagle on the side, and tucked in his pants. The 2 babies were beaten to death. The teenage girl was stripped, raped, and then killed, and then the mother and father were either bludgeoned, shot, or stabbed to death, which leads me to believe that their bodies were so badly mangled that they could not determine a cause of death, which is very sad. The Jean Serrais Center fire occurred in France. 22 people, most of them mentally disturbed teenagers, died in a fire believed to have been set by an arsonist. It's believed that the fire was set by one of the students and it burned for 4 hours. There has never been a motive or suspect found, and that's all the information there is on this case. On June 15th, 1994, Bonnie Dreyfus, her 2 daughters, and her niece were brutally murdered in their mobile home in Pulaski Township, Pennsylvania. At 3 p.m. that day, police received a call from Bonnie's husband, Tom Dreyfus, reporting that he had arrived home and found the bodies. Each person had been stabbed multiple times and their throats had been slashed. There was some evidence that someone named Thomas Kimball killed them, and he was arrested. He went to trial and was found guilty of the murders and was sentenced to death in October of 2000. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturned the conviction, ruling that testimony that hadn't been allowed in could have caused reasonable doubt about Thomas's guilt. In his second trial, the jury found Thomas not guilty and he was freed. No one else has ever been tried for the murder. On November 14th, 1966, a horrible crime took place in the town of Racoon Bend, Texas. A widower by the name of Will, who was in his 80s, was planning on having his daughter Bernice and her husband Alden, both of who were in their 60s, stop by to help him clean his trailer. When Bernice and Alden didn't make it home that night, their son went to the house to check on them. He discovered 4 bodies in the bedroom of the house and called the police. The victims were Will, Bernice, Alden, and Will's 81-year-old neighbor Ray. All 4 had been shot by either a rifle or a shotgun and had fallen upon each other when shot. The shots fired into the victims were so damaging that the funeral director refused an open casket and refused to allow the family to see the dead bodies. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, remember to hit that like and subscribe button and share it with your friends if this is something that they would be interested in. Again, thank you all so much for choosing to spend some time with me today, and I'll catch you in the next one.